I love Persona 5, which is a deeply uncontroversial opinion. I picked it up on a whim because the original version of the game was 80% off on my recently and equally as whimsically bought PS5, and I fell in love with it instantly. From the ridiculously stylish visuals to the charming characters, brilliant premise, snappy gameplay, and fun blend of dungeon crawling and life sim mechanics, Persona 5 is pretty much a game concocted to appeal to me specifically. It was my entry to the Persona franchise at large, and now I've basically played every Persona game available on modern consoles. I seriously cannot stress how much I really like this game. However, if you've seen my big Persona 4 videos, you'd know that at the bottom of my heart, I am a hater by nature. Critiquing things is fun. It's interesting analysing why things in games work, why they occasionally don't, and finally, why the creators made those choices for better or worse. And well, as much as I love it, Persona 5 sure as heck isn't perfect. Unlike Persona 4, however, which is a game that I believe is riddled with major flaws at a fundamental level, most of my problems with Persona 5 are nitpicks. Thematically, the game is solid. The characters, while not as well written as they are in Persona 3, tend to contribute more to the overall narrative than in Persona 4's, and are a hell of a lot more likeable. The game's concept? Great. The pacing? Mostly great. Still, the devil is in the detail, and in an 80 to 120 hour RPG depending on what version you're playing, there's a lot of detail. Before I get into the meat of the video, I want to do a couple of quick housekeeping things. Firstly, this video isn't a recap and is written with the expectation that you, the person watching this, has at least completed the vanilla version of the game. There be spoilers ahead. Secondly, I am only going to be talking about Persona 5's original story here. In other words, I will not be talking about the royal exclusive third semester, Maruki, or Yoshizawa. Why not? Firstly, and most pressingly, it would add 2 hours to this video's runtime. No, thank you. Secondly, the vanilla ending is how the developers intended on concluding Persona 5's story, and I think it's both stronger on a thematic level and flows better into the canon sequel strikers than the royal exclusive ending. However, as royal is the more accessible version of the game, I will be talking about the changes it introduces that affect the vanilla story or gameplay, such as Akechi's Confidant and a revamped Okamura boss fight. If you do want me to yap about the third semester one day, like and subscribe, as attention motivates my monkey brain. Now though, it's time to talk about the first major building block of Persona 5. Themes. Persona 5's main theme is rebellion. This game is all about looking up at oppressive systems and people and going, screw that! And this theme isn't just entrenched in the narrative, but in the visual direction and gameplay too. For one, the main cast are phantom thieves to begin with, as it's a fairly popular trope in Japan, with phantom thieves being viewed as people who skirt the rules and help the little guy at the expense of the big one. In other words, a phantom thief is a classy rebel. And if you've played the game, you'd know that exploring palaces really does make you feel like, well, a phantom thief. You slink around in shadows, pull acrobatic stunts, physically steal loot, and whip out a gun in battle with my favourite menu option in existence. By incorporating all of these elements, the gameplay makes you feel like a modern-day Robin Hood who's about to make some rich bastard's life so much worse. Moving on, red, blacks and whites, the colours used for Persona 5's beloved UI, are all colours associated with revolutionary movements. Each of the Phantom Thieves are designed after a different archetype of rebel/thief as well, with Joker being the stereotypical Phantom Thief, Morgana and Anne both being cat burglars, Ryuji being a pirate, Yusuke being a Ronin, Makoto being a post-apocalyptic raider, etc, etc. Each of the palaces themselves are also based on stereotypical heist locations, such as a bank, a museum, and what have you. Moving on to the narrative side of things, nearly all of the playable characters and confidants are people who would be outcasts in Japan's society, such as former criminals, politicians embroiled in scandals, children from non-traditional households, and most importantly, Redditors. By accepting and aiding these people, Joker gains their support and loyalty, and finds the community that the so-called acceptable side of society denies him due to his criminal record. When it comes to the main plot, Japan's moral values are heavily influenced by Confucianism, which places significantly more importance on obeying the hierarchy than most Western value systems do. This is partially why the villain's abuse is allowed to continue for so long in-universe, and why the Phantom Thieves standing up to each of their targets is so meaningful thematically. Nearly all of the game's major villains hold positions of power and respect over the protagonists, being teachers, mentors, and parents. But the thieves rebel against them anyway, ignoring what society says about respecting your elders and social betters to achieve true justice. In fact, Persona 5 bluntly condemns many things about Japan's culture, from its justice system to the way people brush off others' complaints about society with the excuse, "That's the way it's always been." It rejects the idea that children should just buckle down and accept mistreatment from their parents or parental figures. In fact, it harshly condemns the exploitation of people with less power than you in general. So, Persona 5 expertly and effectively incorporates its themes well, right? Well, yeah, but also, no. A big criticism Persona 5 receives in the leftist gaming circles I'm in is that it doesn't go far enough with its themes, and I generally agree with that perspective. Shido's political alignment is never stated, only inferred. There's no gay romance options, but hey, on the bright side, you can get this teenager to date a bunch of adult women. In a game that spends the entire first arc condemning the bad guy for being a sex predator. On that topic, Anne, who is introduced as a very poignant critique of fetishization, eventually gets turned into the game's fanservice girl, since God forbid the horny otakus don't get a conventionally attractive teenage girl to slobber all over. This leads me to the first of the issues I have with Persona 5 on a thematic basis. While Persona 5 is a great social commentary and rallying cry at times, in general, its themes are really hampered by the fact that it's a marketable product that is afraid to piss potential consumers off. If the Phantom Thieves were really rebellious for one, they'd get piercing, engage in some underage drinking, and probably start some IRL fistfights. Instead, the Phantom Thieves have to be good little students who don't dress too inappropriately or act too vulgarly. They generally don't cross any social boundaries more serious than dyeing their hair, even before Makoto, aka the only Phantom Thief who'd theoretically care about that sort of thing, joins the team. Mind you, I don't actually think the King's Game Round 2, they actually get hammered this time, would really add anything to the story, but I think it demonstrates my point. The Phantom Thieves are undeniably outcasts, yes, but they're not too outside the norm either. They are all conventionally attractive, straight, and light-skinned. The main human antagonist is yet again barely allowed to have an explicit ideology, for God's sake. And that's why you get brain-dead takes like people saying Persona 5 has no politics in it, which definitely wasn't what the devs were aiming for. The second big thematic failure of Persona 5, in my opinion, is the fact that the Phantom Thieves' actions cause no lasting societal change. Sure, they inspire people, yes, but they don't trigger the reform of Japan's justice system that the game's narrative thematically wants them to. Instead, the status quo remains, but now there's hope, whatever the hell that means. This, unfortunately, is a limitation caused by the Persona franchise's setting. The series has always been based on modern-day Japan, which contributes to why the stories and characters feel so real. People like Ryuji, Makoto, and Futaba both can and do exist in real life. You've met them, or are them. When it comes to the villains, we've all experienced the effects of real-life Okamuras and Shidos, alas. The setting, however, is a double-edged sword. ATLUS isn't inherently afraid of making their characters change society. Metaphor Fantasio is a great example of that. Unfortunately, real-life Japan did not have a sudden anti-authoritarianism uprising at the end of December 2016, and so Persona 5 can't have one either. Now, I don't think these things ruin Persona 5's themes by any means. Firstly, to a degree, I think that if you're looking for a narrative that explicitly and harshly condemns our modern society in mainstream media, you are setting yourself up to fail. Because no shit, Persona 5 isn't going to outright state Shinzo Abe's policies are evil. If you want that, you're gonna have to find it in indie media. Plus, while I think my criticisms here are genuine flaws with the game, I also don't think they mitigate the good things I said about Persona 5's themes either. Sure, the Phantom Thieves might not, for example, fix their version of Japan's conviction rate, but that also doesn't change the fact that the Phantom Thieves rebel against figures that society tells them they should just buckle down and accept abuse from. It doesn't change how much the gameplay and visuals embody the idea of being a Phantom Thief. Ultimately, I think I'd rate Persona 5's themes a 7 out of 10. Its rebellion could have gone a lot further, but I think acting like its themes are only skin deep is a disingenuous read as well. Characters. Main cast. I absolutely love Persona 5's core cast, which I am counting as the Phantom Thieves, Akechi, Sojiro, Sai, and to a lesser degree, Mishima. I think in terms of dynamics and personalities, they are my favourite Persona cast by a mile. I think ATLUS's ability to write good banter has improved a lot since Persona 4, because outside of one or two scenes, while the thieves bicker and tease each other, it never feels mean-spirited. Well, sure, not every relationship between the individual thieves is particularly compelling or fleshed out. There's also a lot of interesting dynamics between the members of the main cast, such as Anne and Ryuji's childhood friendship, their strife with Makoto, then Makoto's connection to Akechi, etc, etc. Also, unlike many people, I'm happy that there's not too many Persona 4 style filler scenes between them, as they only ever succeeded in A, making me bored, or B, making me like the investigation team even less. I will say though that I think the new text conversations and photos Royal added are a happy medium between the two extremes, but frankly, I loved the thieves as a collective even in the vanilla version of the game. Most of the main cast are also very interesting on a thematic level. Many of them are either in very vulnerable positions due to a lack of supportive adult figures, or they live in non-traditional family dynamics that receive a lot of stigma. Many of them fundamentally cannot fit into traditional Japanese society due to inherent factors they can't change, like Anne's race or Joker's criminal record. Their mere existence in the story contributes to and enhances its themes. I also think that the non-thief supporting characters are far stronger than figures like Ikutsuki and Dojima in the previous games, both feeling more relevant and having more convincing character arcs. Do I think ATLUS nailed the main cast, however? No. Because while Persona 5's character writing tends to take the groundwork of Persona 4's and elevate it to a whole new level, it still gets bogged down by one of Persona 4's worst decisions. And that's moving Second Awakenings into the social links, instead of having them incorporated into the main plot a la Persona 3. As a result of this, how relevant each Phantom Thief is to the story is extremely lopsided. While some manage to be important figures in the plot even after their joining arcs have ended, others of them lose relevance quite quickly, or could have quite frankly been removed from the party after their introductory arc, as they have no effect on the plot whatsoever after that point. The other issue with shunting the bulk of some of the thieves' character arcs into their Confidants is that it can cause inconsistencies with the main plot. Ryuji is a particularly egregious example of this. Given he's a founding member of the Thieves, there's a very good chance you've finished his social link before the Okamura arc starts. If you do that, however, his behaviour in said arc comes off as extremely out of character, given he matured out of his retaliatory behaviour in said link. While Persona 5's cast is still my favourite despite these issues, from a writing perspective, I think Persona 3's are just objectively better. Let's look at them in more depth. This is roughly how well I think each of the main characters are written in the main story. Note, this is not how much I like them. That's a very different list. So, what criteria am I judging them by? Firstly, there's character development. How much does the character, or our understanding of him, change over the course of the game? Secondly, there's interpersonal connections. Do they have compelling relationships with other members of the cast? Finally, there's relevance. What do they contribute to the overall story? What I'm not judging them on is social link quality, unless said link has a notable effect on how the character is perceived in the main story. This is because 90% of the time, the confidants are completely optional. Starting from best to worst, let's begin this with Sojiro. I assume most of you are probably a little bit surprised to see him topping the list. But when you thought about it, you realised that, yeah, that actually tracks. Because I think it is a very common fandom consensus that Sojiro Sakura freaking slaps. In many ways, Sojiro is the anti-Dojima. There's a lot of deliberate similarities between the two. Both of them are older male figures that take in the protagonist for a year. They have daughters they care about a lot, and they both share the Hierophant Arcana. That's kind of where the similarities end, however, because unlike Dojima, who starts off as a reasonable authority figure, gets less reasonable over time, and never really makes up for that, Sojiro starts the game seemingly hating your guts. He's brusque, quick to point out that Joker sticking his nose where it didn't belong was what got him into his situation in the first place, and gives Joker the semi-unreasonable task of cleaning up LeBlanc's filthy attic. While Sojiro starts the game as an A-grade grump, however, quite quickly cracks begin to show on his mask. He prepares the protagonist's breakfast. He teaches them how to make coffee. He lets Morgana, the cat Joker attempted to smuggle home without permission, stay in LeBlanc with no arguments. Still, while Sojiro slowly loosens up towards Joker over time, there's still this distance between them, which, in a bit of ludonarrative brilliance, is shown in his Confidant. It stalls at a certain point until the Futaba arc is finished, and back to the Futaba arc, his moments there are great. When Joker first begins to pry into Futaba's identity, Sojiro jumps back to his pre-development state, and his anger is so jarring. Once the truth comes out, however, we finally see the true Sojiro, a man who's been beaten down by grief after losing the woman he loved. A man who wants to do the best for his daughter, but doesn't know how. While I think it would have been very easy for ATLUS to make Sojiro lose relevance after the Futaba arc wraps up, this isn't the case. His presence is fairly notable in the Sai arc as well, where, even though he's getting driven up the wall with worry, he provides a safe haven for the Phantom Thieves. And finally, it's revealed he once knew Shido, leader of the conspiracy, which ties him into Persona 5's wider story as well. Sojiro has it all. He's connected to numerous members of the cast. His character development spans almost the entirety of the game, starting in the Kamoshida arc and reaching its climax in the Sai arc, where, despite his worry and anger, he gives his kids, plural, the support they need. His social link is goated. All in all, Sojiro is the epitome of the dad that stepped up. I think the closest thing I can give to a critique of his character arc is that I wish Sojiro had a few on-screen interactions with Shido. However, that would be for Shido's sake as opposed to his, so I'm not subtracting any points from him for that. Akechi. Akechi is pretty quickly set up to be one of the Phantom Thieves' greatest opponents. His intelligence and charisma is shown the second he meets the thieves, with him being able to turn the once fairly Phantom Thief positive Shuden students against them in a single conversation. Throughout their encounters in the game, it's fairly obvious that Akechi knows damn well who the thieves are, and is just waiting for the right evidence to bring them in. Or blackmail them into completing a palace that's a blatant trap in an attempt to arrest Joker and execute him inside an interrogation room. A plan that would have worked if Akechi was actually as smart as he thinks he is. Before I talk about Black Mask Akechi, however, I want to talk about his Detective Prince persona for a little bit. He's good at using his gentle appearance and light humour to make himself come off as disarming. And then, once someone lets down their guard, he brings out the wit and intelligence, controlling a conversation as he desires. Akechi is also fairly good at downplaying it when his true personality leaks out. He makes numerous dismissive or rude comments to characters such as the Najima siblings and Ryuji over the game, but gets away with it all, as he's good at masking the nastiness of what he's saying with his perfect princely act. I also think there's a lot of very fun narrative implications of his role as the Detective Prince. Firstly, Persona 4 players probably pegged him as a late-game party member, a la Naoto, which probably makes Akechi's betrayal all the more surprising to them. Secondly, while his role as the Detective Prince seemingly gives Akechi power, and does to a degree, like most of the other thieves, it's also ripe for exploitation. Shido uses him as a mouthpiece to further his agenda, not caring about the abuse Akechi receives when he criticizes the thieves at the height of their popularity. Akechi tailors his public appearance to be as appealing to the public as possible, to satisfy his desire for positive attention. But while he gives the people what they want, they fail to make him happy in turn, as this connection between them is fundamentally shallow. I also think Prince Kechi is an interesting form of rebellion too. He's an undesirable child after all. He's a hitman. He's a murderer. And yet, he's hoodwinked all of these fools into believing he's a prince. Now though, onto his real self. The Black Mask. Akechi willingly signed up to be Shido's metaverse assassin, destroying the lives of numerous people. Also, Akechi could hold the truth about his crimes and heritage over Shido's head, and ruin his life once it's at its very apex. His rebellion is a deeply selfish justice that hurts people en masse to soothe his own pain. Except, unfortunately for Akechi, he shares his hated father's fatal flaw: pride. Shido knew that Akechi was going to betray him the whole freaking time. He manipulated his own child into becoming a murderer, intending on throwing him away the second Akechi ran out of use. Akechi hurt numerous people, destroying families like his own was destroyed, for a plan that was doomed from the start. Akechi completely and utterly underestimated Shido, too high on his success to even contemplate that Shido was planning to betray him first. Finally, this very pride is why Akechi lost to the Phantom Thieves. He's smarter and stronger than them on an individual basis, and therefore, he underestimated them. While Akechi managed to manipulate the thieves into his trap, surprise! It didn't work, because he gave himself away to the thieves in their very first encounter. I enjoy Akechi's true personality too. He's unhinged, bitter, and violent, but despite his mania, he retains the wit that made him so dangerous to begin with. I think Akechi's just really neat. Though, as you noticed, I didn't put him in S tier. Why? While his only truly compelling relationship is his one with Joker, I think he has just enough connections with characters like the Nijimas for me to not hold that against Akechi. No, he's an A tier because of his confidant in both versions of the game. In the vanilla version of Persona 5, his confidant ranks up automatically and mainly consists of Akechi subtly heckling Joker. While I think it does a great job of selling their rivalry, as yeah, up until the engine room I wanted to punch Akechi's teeth in. It does a very bad job of selling the fact that they are friends. While Akechi has intense feelings towards Joker regardless of the version you are playing, in vanilla Persona 5, Akechi is just another background confidant to Joker, which lessens the tragedy of his sacrifice. In Royal, however, Akechi's very good confidant elaborates on his backstory and actually gives him and Joker a proper friendship. In Royal, Joker actually has a reason to feel deeply upset by Akechi's death. His rank 8 and the scene with the glove, yeah, it's divine. The problem is, however, that it completely undermines their rivalry by making Akechi far too likable early in the game. I don't want to beat the crap out of Royal Akechi, and I think that's a pretty damn big problem given his role in the narrative. So yeah, Akechi is stuck in A tier, but still, that's not a bad place to be. Makoto. Just like Akechi, Makoto's character development is juicy. Before she starts to step into the spotlight at the tail end of the Kamoshida arc, there's a couple of optional encounters you can have with her beforehand, which do a nice job of foreshadowing the direction of her character arc. If you talk to Makoto in the library, she'll snootily dismiss you, clearly not thinking Crime Boy Joker is worthy of her time. However, if you talk to her after Shiho jumps, Makoto was horrified. Despite her dreadful first impression, she isn't a bad person at heart. Albeit, that might be difficult for players to believe initially given the reason she enters the main plot is due to Kobayakawa forcing her to hunt down the Phantom Thieves. She treats the task as an annoying burden at first, which instantly rubs Ryuji and Anne in particular the wrong way. Still, while Makoto proves she's smart, guessing the thieves' identities instantly, It's also made clear that she's not a threat. In other words, she's a bit useless. Then, however, the Kaneshiro arc rocks around, and we begin to see more into her internal life. The reason Makoto's so focused on her schoolwork? It's because her older sister is constantly getting on her case about it, basically acting like Makoto is going to be a total failure unless she's academically perfect. We see that despite Anne's suspicions, Makoto has no real power at school and is horrified about Kamoshida's actions. We see that after Madarame's confession, Makoto realizes in her guts that the Phantom Thieves are in the right, something that troubles her given what the two main authority figures in her life, Kobayakawa and Sai, are both saying. And when she expresses emotional vulnerability to a man that should be a mentor figure in her life, admitting she doesn't think they should be looking for the thieves, Kobayakawa basically blackmails Makoto into doing his bidding, holding her higher education and Sai's reputation over her head. On to Sai herself. When Makoto tries to use her sister as a sounding board for these complicated feelings, Sai basically bites her freaking head off. Combined with Akechi and Anne then needling at her insecurities, it's no wonder Makoto snaps, acts on impulse, and gets herself mixed up in organised crime. While Kaneshiro not having a personal connection to Makoto often gets a lot of flack, I actually like it because her awakening isn't about him. He's just the last straw, because on a superficial level, unlike most of the other Phantom Thieves, Makoto could theoretically fit into Japanese society at large. She doesn't have to rebel, but she can only do that if she both sacrifices her morals and allows those in power to use her as a tool. And for a while, Makoto did that, ignoring her instincts and her pain in order to appease those higher on the hierarchy than she is. Her awakening is the moment she rejects that, clinging to her justice instead. Unlike many of the other thieves, she also gets emotional beats after the Kaneshiro arc ends. For one, Makoto's deteriorating relationship with Sai remains in the spotlight, with Makoto growing more and more upset with her sister's behaviour over time. Despite that though, Makoto is convinced that Sai isn't too far gone and can see the errors of her ways. Makoto trusts her gut, signing off on Futaba's plan to use Sai to save Joker's life, and gets rewarded for it. Finally, while this is more minor, the more the player interacts with Makoto, the more they realise her cold behaviour from the start of the game wasn't entirely caused by mean-spiritedness. Makoto's just really socially awkward. In fact, the more she's with the thieves, the more we see Makoto's kindness. She's one of the characters who tries to reach out to Futaba the most, and while she doesn't tend to do a great job at it, Makoto does try to be a sort of big sister figure to her. She apologises for her actions in the Kamoshida arc to Anne, and the two become good friends. So, what are my gripes with Makoto? The first thing that probably comes to your mind is her social link, which is mostly incorrect. Quite frankly, I think it's seriously overhated. It's a generally inoffensive B-tier link in my opinion, and unlike Akechi's, it doesn't really cause any particular dissonance with the main narrative. It's about Makoto, whose main flaw at first was ignoring her instincts that the Phantom Thieves were the good guys, trusting her gut that there's something wrong about her high school friend's adult boyfriend, and following her deceased father's footsteps in the process. Now, I don't hugely like her becoming a cop at the end of it, but I think people forget that A, Makoto explicitly wants to do it to stop police brutality, something she states out loud, and B, while it's a dumb idea that's not going to work, guys, she's a terminally offline Japanese teenager. She's not going to be well versed on leftist theory. On the whole, while I don't think Makoto's link is great, I don't think it's a steaming pile of garbage either. No. My first issue with Makoto is that she doesn't get anywhere near enough interesting moments in Sai's palace. But I'll talk about it in more detail in the plot section. Outside of one scene, there's like nothing. I also think that while the game does a good job at showing the changing state of her and her sister's relationship before Sai's palace, it rushes over the arc's conclusion, with Sai just giving Makoto an apology in a plot dump scene before the story moves on and forgets about them. This sort of leads into my second issue, and that's that Makoto's arc is a bit too subtle. So many people completely fail to pick up what it's about, and what Makoto's actual big character flaw is. While Makoto has the disadvantage of being a serious female character with ship tease with the yaoiable male protagonist, which by default makes a certain section of the fanbase hate her, I do think the game should have made it clearer that Makoto's main deal is that she has good instincts she doesn't always trust due to societal pressure, which is a mindset she grows out of during the game. But now though, it's time to talk about the final A-grade character, Futaba. Out of all of the cast, Futaba probably changes as a person the most drastically. Introduced as a brusque voice barking demands at the Phantom Thieves over text, her bark soon turns out to be the bluster of a deeply terrified girl drowning in her own guilt, who only finds the courage to contact the people she suspects might be able to save her due to Futaba's fear Sai will use her to hurt Sojiro, the last family member she has in her life. We then get one of the most interesting parts of the game from a ludo-narrative perspective. The first palace that inspires not disgust, but sympathy. We physically see the isolation Futaba feels, the way she wants connection, but pushes people away due to fear. Her bedroom is a tomb she constructed for herself due to her misplaced guilt over her mother's death, who she's turned into a literal monster in her mind. Throughout this, we also see a lot of who Futaba is in Sojiro's eyes. He's the one who brings up the harsh dissonance between her palace and reality. He's also so desperate to save Futaba, it really adds that extra layer of motivation for the players to clear her palace. And when they do, a process that gives Futaba the epiphany that her mother didn't kill herself, but was murdered. All of her years of guilt and isolation, it was for nothing. Some men in suits ruined Futaba's life, since, as the clearly neurodivergent child of a single mother, she was a convenient scapegoat. On the whole, I tend to find neurodivergent representation in media better when it's unintentional, because even if their mental illnesses have a large impact on their life, neurodivergent people are still people. Except a lot of so-called representation forgets that and makes characters that are literally nothing but the specific form of neurodivergence writers want to represent. That's why I think the best neurodivergent representation generally tends to be writers basing someone off a quirky person they know, because then the characters get to be actual people too. Futaba, however, has so many visibly autistic traits, including ones that aren't always associated with the condition. I think that ATLUS actively and intentionally wrote her specifically as someone on the spectrum. And yet, Futaba still gets to be a person as well. She wants revenge on her mother's killer. Once she's comfortable around someone, she reveals a joking and mischievous side. While I'm on the topic, clearing her palace also doesn't fix Futaba. She's not suddenly comfortable with the thieves. She's still blunt, anxious, and somewhat socially graceless. And so, the game devotes an entire week to her speedrunning friendships with each of the pre-existing thieves. She has autism to autism miscommunication with Yusuke and Makoto. She quickly warms up to Anne and Ryuji, who, unlike the previous group, actually know how to interact with people. Even after this though, Futaba still shuts down on occasions, most notably when Sojiro discovers the calling card in her room. While she blue screens for a bit, however, eventually she finds her courage and sticks up to her guardian in favour of her friends. It's good! So, what are my Futaba gripes? First of all, while she remains a key member of the party in terms of logistical importance, being the one to uncover Akechi's true nature and come up with the plan to save Joker from the interrogation room, she doesn't get as much emotional beats after her arc ends as I'd like. After Futaba's encounter with Sojiro in the Sai arc, it's kind of crickets. Most of her rage towards Akechi and Shido, her mother's killers, is lost amongst the tide of the rest of the Phantom Thieves' fury. Secondly, to a much lesser degree, there's her social link. I love the start of it, with her bouncing off characters like Makoto and Mishima, but the second half is where I have gripes. It's very romance-coded, even before the option to date her comes up, unlike many of the other romance links. However, the main story and Sojiro's confidant heavily push Futaba as your younger sibling, and this just causes a lot of dissonance if you say, get a hyper-sibling coded scene after choosing to date her. No, Futaba is not actually incest, and anyone who thinks so is a little bit dumb, but man, the writing just feels so sloppy. If ATLUS wanted Futaba to be your cute little sister, they shouldn't have made her a romance option, or should have, at bare minimum, had no romantic elements to said link unless the player actively tries to date her. Alternatively, if ATLUS wanted Futaba to explicitly have a crush on the player, frame her as a girl for crushing the player in the main story. Ryuji is Persona 5's bro character, and damn, he does a good job at it. Much like Sojiro, he's slightly abrasive at first, but soon that attitude fades, and with an hour of meeting the protagonist, he's already willing to die to save Joker from Kamoshida. This is basically Ryuji's character distilled to its very essence. He's brash and rude and not the brightest, but makes up for it with his massive heart. Much like Joker, Ryuji is one of Shujin's biggest outcasts. Kamoshida stole his one ticket to a bright future, his athletic ability. Ryuji instantly recognizes the injustice of his situation, but while he wants to rebel and get back at the adults who ruined his life, he has no way of doing it effectively, instead just dyeing his hair and skirting the uniform code. Perhaps that's why the power of changing hearts eventually goes to his head. Let's nix that line of inquiry for now. Either way, the game establishes a narratively compelling reason for Ryuji and borderline blank slate Joker to become instant besties, which is why I think out of all of the bro MC dynamics, Joker and Ryuji have the best one. Joker isn't Ryuji's only strong relationship though, no. He's childhood friends with Anne and Shiho, the latter of which motivates him to take the plunge and risk changing Kamoshida's heart, and the former of which makes the thieves as a whole start off with a really strong dynamic. He's also buddies with Mishima, and they get numerous scenes together later down the line. Finally, Ryuji clashes with Makoto a bit before she joins the team, albeit not as much as Anne does. All of these connections make both Ryuji and the game's world in general feel richer and more lived in. They're good. Even after the Kamoshida arc ends, Ryuji remains a fairly big presence in the story. He and Morgana sort of split the role of being Joker's voice between them, with Ryuji in particular often being the one to push the thieves forwards to their next target. Hell, there wouldn't even be Phantom Thieves if Ryuji hadn't suggested they kept it up. doesn't just remain a focal character, however. Ryuji actually gets character development in an arc that isn't his starting one. Unfortunately, Ryuji is in B tier for a reason, and part of that is because said character development is so poorly implemented. Yeah, I'm talking about the Okamura arc. I want to save most of this discussion for the plot section, but essentially, Ryuji has this arc where the Phantom Thief's fame goes to his head, causing him to lose sight of his justice for a little bit. In theory, I actually like this arc quite a lot. In execution, however, it feels a bit abrupt, as, well, it's not established that Ryuji is particularly attention-seeking until the end of the Kaneshiro arc. It is established that a strong sense of justice is one of his most fundamental character traits at the very start of the game. The fame getting to Ryuji's head just doesn't feel like a logical progression of the character introduced in Act 1. Secondly, his petty spat with Morgana in the Okamura arc feels so out of character if you've completed Ryuji's Confidant at that point. Now, unlike many other people in the fandom, I don't think that Ryuji is particularly emotionally intelligent. He's somewhat tactless, not always great at reading the mood, and tends to let his emotions get to him. In his social link, however, he decides not to target the awful new track teacher in Mementos, and instead gives his former team the chance to take on the man on their own terms. It's a very mature moment for Ryuji, and works quite well if the player completes his Confidant during, say, the Sai arc. It is so jarring, however, to see him act as bullheaded as he does in the Okamura arc if you've already completed this link beforehand. Alas, it's not just his behaviour in the Okamura arc that docks writing quality points from Ryuji. The next thing I want to bring up is what I dub the cutscene Ryuji phenomenon. Basically, in the game's animated cutscenes, Ryuji is significantly more of a perverted arsehole than he is in the game's actual text. His introductory scene involves Ryuji getting furious at Kamoshida for perving on Anne, and yet, 3 arcs later, cutscene Ryuji blatantly ogles the breast of his friend who is a sexual assault victim. Yikes! This is not a good look for either Ryuji or ATLUS. As much as I hate this fact, I do also think it's kind of interesting from a meta perspective. It's been low-key confirmed that the animations in Persona 5 were made before the devs had finished polishing the characters / plot. Haru in the vanilla Persona 5 opening is the perfect demonstration of this. In the intro animation, she looks cold and aloof, as that was what her personality was originally going to be, before ATLUS decided to make her nice and polite instead. I assume this is why cutscene Ryuji exists. He likely resembled his spiritual predecessor Yosuke Hanamura a bit more in the earlier stages of Persona 5's development. And if you've seen my Persona 4 videos, you'll know how much I hate Yosuke. My final and most minor Ryuji issue is how goddamn mean the writers are to him. The scene where the Phantom Thieves beat Ryuji up after Shido's palace is infamous for a reason. It's bad, and I do just think that Ryuji deserved a bit more respect in universe. Morgana. Morgana is the second of Persona's wacky animal mascots, and is an improvement on his predecessor in pretty much every way. First of all, I think it's kind of funny how much Morgana's personality is affected by him being, well, a cat. He starts off being fairly aloof, especially considering how emotional most characters are during the Kamoshida arc. Morgana's also notably arrogant, and while this gets tempered over time, it never really fades. Despite these traits though, deep down inside, Morgana is fairly insecure and craves validation. Aloof and arrogant? But needy? Yep, cat. While not sharing any history with anyone else due to his origins, the game actively makes up for this by establishing numerous strong, plot-relevant relationships between Morgana and the rest of the game's cast. Firstly, Morgana and Joker develop a rapport quite quickly, with Joker basically turning non-functional when Morgana leaves. Morgana and Ryuji fight like cats and dogs, while Morgana is instantly besotted with Anne. He also has a pretty strong dynamic with the Sakura family, with Morgana being the character who brings out Sojiro's soft side to begin with, while Morgana's friction with Futaba is a key trigger for the Okamura arc. Finally, he gets to be a mentor figure to Haru, which deserves highlighting as it's the only relationship of substance Haru gets to have with anyone. Back to Morgana though, he doesn't just get to have well-developed relationships with numerous other cast members. He's also an integral part of the game's greater scope story. He's the vehicle used to introduce the greater mystery of mementos at the start of the game, something the story doesn't act upon until Arc 8. Because of Morgana's importance to that plotline, it means that he gets an automatic social link, which is a huge boon for him, as it means he gets character development spanning the entire story. And it's a solid arc too. Despite his initial arrogance, Morgana soon develops a complex about his identity, wondering if he is just a random metaverse creature after all. His insecurities get compounded as the Phantom Thieves grow out of needing a mentor, coupled with Futaba making him irrelevant as a navigator. Finally, he lashes out at the team, taking out his negative feelings on them as it's easier than accepting his perceived failings, eventually leaving the team for a stint. This is resolved when the thieves tell Morgana he's not one of them because he's useful, but because he's their friend, and it doesn't matter to them at all whether he's human or not. This allows Morgana to accept his identity as humanity's hope in the game's climax, and no longer hampered by his insecurities, his love for humanity as a whole allows him to give Joker the final push he needs to summon Saturnine, saving the day. If you've ever hung out in the Persona 5 fandom, however, you'd probably know that Morgana is fairly unpopular on the whole. So, why is that the case? First of all, people decry Morgana for two reasons I fundamentally disagree with. Number one of those reasons is the fact that Morgana serves as Joker's inner monologue for most of the game. In Persona 4, for example, you can't do anything after spending the day in the TV world, with you getting a bland line of dialogue saying, "No, I'm tired," if you try to leave the dojimas in the evening. This is a gameplay limitation that exists for a reason, encouraging players to use their time carefully and therefore minimize the number of dungeon visits, which ramps up the difficulty of said dungeons. In Persona 5, however, ATLUS decided to replace these bland gameplay messages with Morgana's dialogue, to add a bit of character when interacting with things in the overworld. This, however, led to players getting frustrated with Morgana for the game's limitations, whereas in reality, those obstructions would exist whether Morgana was in the story or not. Joker was going to go to sleep all of those moments anyway. Secondly, the fanbase tends to place the onus of Morgana and Ryuji's shitty behaviour on Morgana, blaming him for their feud. Except, this is just blatantly false. While Morgana escalates things, often being quite nasty in the process of it, Ryuji started it and kept it up. They both contribute to this dynamic and their resulting falling out in the Okamura arc. That, though, brings up the elephant in the room: Morgana's behaviour during that arc. Much like Ryuji, I like the idea of what happens there on paper. The execution of it is dreadful, however, with the inciting incident behind Morgana leaving the team being particularly contrived. This puts a huge damper on Morgana's character in general, and it's one I, like many other people, struggle to get past. My next big issue with Morgana as a whole are some of his running gags. Much like Teddy, he's frequently used for comic relief, but while none of his reoccurring jokes are harmful or anything, they also don't tend to be very funny either. Exhibit A is the whole "not a cat" gag. It gets tiring quite quickly and really blunts the emotional weight of Morgana's insecurity when the game's been treating them as a joke up until the point they get plot relevant. Secondly, there's his crush on Anne. As mentioned before, it's a gag about her being a cat girl, and is kind of funny in theory. Unfortunately, Morgana doesn't develop his crush on Anne due to her awakening, but due to seeing her cognition in Kamoshida's palace. Yikes. Then there's the fact that he never really gets over it, even though I think Morgana's crush on Anne is something that really should have started to die down around the Okamura arc. This is a perfect segue to my final Morgana complaint, and that's that the localization does him dirty. The Lady Anne gag is a perfect example of that. It makes him sound like a dude bro in English. However, in Japanese, he's not using sama, the traditional translation of lady, but dono, which is way more formal. Stupidly formal, in fact. The second thing is his speech patterns. Morgana uses wakahai as his pronoun, which is firstly extremely pretentious, and secondly is a reference to the novel I Am a Cat. Unfortunately, there really isn't any way to translate that directly, and as a result, Morgana's English speech patterns are just very indistinctive, outside of the occasional cat pun, and therefore miss a lot of the humour his Japanese ones have. Sai. On a conceptual level, I think Sai is possibly the most interesting character in the entire game. The climax and resolution of her arc is just so powerful. She's a palace ruler, and not a completely toothless one like Futaba either. By the time November is nearing its end, Sai is not a nice person. While I do think Akechi's suspicions that she actively forged evidence are somewhat unfounded, that doesn't change the fact that she accepted dodgy evidence from the cops without doing due diligence. And oh yeah, threatened Sojiro about Futaba's custody. Sai is desperate to achieve her goals. Secondly, and more subtly, Sai is also a bit of a coward. She's so hurt by her father's death, she lashes out at Makoto whenever she says anything nice about him. In part due to her being very firmly at the anger stage in the cycle of grief, but also quite likely because Sai doesn't want her sister to follow in his footsteps. Sai's palace is a rigged casino in part due to her fear of taking risks. She wants to win because she thinks if she loses, her life will be over. Despite all of that, however, Sai gambles everything. Not because Joker convinced her of his justice, but to save a teenage boy's life. If Sai had gotten caught by Akechi or the conspiracy when smuggling him out of the interrogation room, it wouldn't have just been her job at risk, but her life. And yet, without hesitation, Sai saves Joker anyway, despite the fact that she is at the height of her distortion. Sai then apologizes to those she's hurt. No supernatural malarkey required. She then strives to take down Shido, and as soon as she does, she leaves the job her entire life once revolved around to become a defense attorney. A job in Japan that has a 99% lose rate. Like God, that is just so juicy to me. I also think she's a really interesting depiction of villainy in the game. Because in reality, she doesn't really have that much power compared to the other palace rulers. No. Sai represents the banal evil of a cog in a corrupt machine. Someone who isn't inherently malicious, but has been so worn down by the people around her and the system itself, she's slowly becoming just like the people who caused her own suffering. In fact, due to her gender, Sai is inherently disadvantaged in a way far more akin to the Phantom Thieves than the other palace rulers. In many ways, Sai's arc feels like ATLUS's personal rewrite of Naruto's Butchered One. A large chunk of Sai's screen time is dedicated to exploring workplace misogyny. Her bosses don't promote her despite the fact that she's clearly intelligent, connecting the Phantom Thieves to the mental shutdowns and breakdowns in May. The SIU director deliberately exploits her, making promises to Sai he was never going to fulfill. Some of Akechi's comments to her skirt the edge of misogyny too, like the ones about her appearance and intelligence. Finally, the proxy SIU director basically fires Sai with a gross "get back in the kitchen" style justification. Because of this misogyny, however, the conspiracy completely underestimates her, not realizing she's teamed up with the thieves until Shido is in the midst of his change of heart. Moving on to Sai's relationships, she's one of the few people who actually associates with Akechi. While this relationship is completely bogus, it does its job narratively speaking. It's used to help show Akechi's intelligence and false sense of justice. It gives Makoto and Akechi a connection by proxy, and finally, there's some foreshadowing of his true nature in it. I do wish we got a scene of him and Sai together after Akechi's betrayal, but honestly, that's a minor complaint. More pressing is Sai's relationship with Makoto, which on paper is deeply fascinating. While she loves and cares for Makoto, Sai deeply resents her too. Her father's death forced Sai into a guardian role she wasn't at all equipped for, forcing her to grow up far too quickly. The useless incident reeks of financial insecurity from Sai's side, which makes me think that they struggled money-wise for a bit too. Seeing Makoto getting to enjoy the youth Sai lost and not having to deal with the treacherous adult world, it, more than anything else, makes me believe that Sai's sin is envy. While Sai's treatment of Makoto is completely unjustified, as none of this is Makoto's fault, it's also fairly human, which I appreciate in writing. You've probably noticed, however, that I've said on paper a fair few times here, and that's because the first half of Sai's character arc is missing. We don't get to see her slow decline in morality caused by external pressures. We don't get to see how trauma corrupted her into a worse version of herself. We don't get to see why Makoto loves her so much, or why she had any faith Sai would rescue Joker at all. Because Sai starts the story as a freaking asshole. Well, sure, the useless incident is clearly an outlier. It's not like she was being particularly nice towards Makoto before that point. She basically spends all their time together whining about her life and telling Makoto to study. I'm not saying we should have had the sisters having a perfect relationship at the start, no, but ATLUS really needed to give Sai a few more moments of genuine affection towards Makoto before November. In general, the game is just so allergic to actually delving into who Sai is as a person pre-interrogation room. We get a few hints that Sai's traumatized in her dialogue, a couple of lines of speculation about why Sai's like this from Makoto, and a single line of dialogue from her shadow that even in universe is treated as a giant nothing burger. Hell, her social link doesn't reveal anything about her as a person and isn't even a full 10 ranks. Sai's palace is also deeply impersonal, unlike Futaba's. I'll talk about it more in the plot section, but the only really humanizing thing it does is portray the fact that Sai views people as human beings. If that alone was meant to show that Sai is a good guy after all, congrats ATLUS. It failed, as viewing people as people is the bare minimum. Anyway, while the good parts of Sai's arc are like S-tier level brilliant, the bad bits are so bad, it firmly bogs her down in B. Mishima. I debated for a bit on whether to count Mishima as a main character or not, and decided he's just prominent enough to be included, if only because he appears in a pivotal endgame cutscene. Assuming you've maxed out his confidant, that is. Mishima starts off the story in a fairly pitiable state. Until the Shiho incident, he's been beaten down so much by Kamoshida he's barely more than a shell. And, well, he's also just a bit pathetic. Kamoshida pushes him into leaking Joker's criminal record and gets him to fetch Shiho on that fateful day. At the same time though, Joker can't hold those things against him, as Mishima is just so clearly a victim. While these experiences eventually help Mishima find his backbone, unlike Ryuji and Anne, he isn't lucky enough to end up in the metaverse. Instead, he starts the fan site in hopes of helping the thieves and pops up numerous times in a supporting role throughout the main story because of that. I think the most interesting thing about him is that Mishima is a fairly realistic depiction of what someone living on the periphery of something as fantastical as the Phantom Thieves would be like. He's super eager to help at first, and while this enthusiasm doesn't dim, it begins to get tainted over time. Because a part of Mishima feels like being on the outside isn't enough. He wants to be a Phantom Thief so badly, but also knows he can't, and delves into a lot of behaviour that skirts the line because of this. While a lot of people hate this part of his character arc, I can't help but think that's because they feel a little bit called out. Because yeah, I think most people would behave like Mishima in his shoes. I think his jealousy, while bad, is natural, and if you think you wouldn't feel any in his boots, you probably need to do a little bit of self-reflection. That's not Mishima's only personality trait that annoys people, however. He can be a bit weird in the spent too much time on Reddit way. I think that people tend to be a bit too harsh on Mishima for this though, especially since Futaba delves into similar behaviour to a lesser degree, but I basically never see people call her out for, say, some of the weird things she says about the other girls' bodies. Generally speaking, while a few of Mishima's comments definitely deserve an eye roll, it also does feel like he'll look back on them when he's 20 and die of embarrassment. I think my actual critiques of Mishima revolve around his confidant. I think it's good. We see that his decline is caused by lingering trauma from childhood bullying, which really is a thing that messes you up. And while Joker gives Mishima an intervention, much like Sai beforehand, it's ultimately Mishima that decides to change his behaviour, becoming a better, more confident person because of it. The problem with his confidant, however, is that if you don't complete it, the scene where Mishima rallies Tokyo in the endgame gets cut, with him being replaced by some random no one. I just think that's so ugh, especially since it's a really good ending to his arc. While he never becomes a thief, his contributions still help save the world. That's peak, and shouldn't have been optional. Joker. So, Joker has an absolutely fantastic character design. I think we can all agree on that. His metaverse self is sleek and stylish, possessing a dramatic flair while not being too in your face. Meanwhile, his real-world self is plain and unassuming, a perfect Clark Kent to his Superman. And he's got a fairly interesting premise as well. Joker is a wrongfully convicted criminal who essentially got punished for doing the right thing as he tried to stand up to someone higher up in the social hierarchy than himself. If you've ever had to do a background check for a job, etc., you'd be aware just how life-affecting and life-ruining a criminal record could be. It makes him a social pariah in Shujin too, with Joker having to forge most of his non-party connections outside of the school. So, his design and backstory are both deliciously thematic. Unfortunately for Joker, a premise and a backstory does not a character make, especially if they're an ATLUS silent protagonist. Because while Joker has a handful of consistent character traits, he's generally selfless and has a strong sense of justice for one, he's not a fully fledged character, but the skeleton of 3 separate ones designed for the player to project their thoughts and feelings onto. Case in point, Joker's dialogue options tend to come in 3 different shades. There's nice, normal Joker, slightly goofy Joker, and then there's slightly colder, meaner Joker. Some people are probably gonna come at me and say, "But Rambashlings, Joker is an actual character with in-depth feelings as he feels all of those things simultaneously." Ludonarratively speaking, however, that's impossible, as sometimes the dialogue options just flat out contradict each other. I think my best argument for the fact that Joker is not a consistent character and is instead a player insert is this. Namely, a Joker who's obsessed with Akechi and spends each day after his death mourning by himself in the jazz gen is equally as canon as a Joker who ignores Akechi as much as possible and instead is an unrepentant heterosexual horn dog with relationships with half a dozen different women. Joker can be both of those characters, but he can't be both of them simultaneously, as those are just fundamentally different people. In fact, I would argue that even some of his consistent character traits get thrown out when it suits ATLUS. The Outer Bath bad ending is a good example of that, with Ren abandoning his principles for fame, which completely contradicts the whole selfless shtick he's got going on. So Joker isn't a character, but a cool looking skin suit, and I kind of think that sucks. In general, I find that if a story is any more plot and character focused than, say, a Pokemon game, traditional silent protagonists aren't a good choice. For one, Joker can't move the plot forward in interesting ways. He has a very muted reaction to large plot events, just in case they contradict how the player feels about things. Every single Confidant suffers for this, as while I love the characters in them, I'd much rather see them interact with each other than Joker, as Joker is just a highly decorated piece of cardboard. He would have benefited a lot from being more like Shez's Fire Emblem, aka an actual character who the player can pick some dialogue options for, or hell, Will Metaphor Refantasio, who at least gets lines sometimes. Still, I can acknowledge my aversion to silent protagonists in story-driven games is kind of a me thing to a degree, so I was disinclined to put Joker into bottom tier for that reason. Plus, by silent protagonist standards, Joker still has some charm points. Like I said, he's got a great design, a fun backstory, and some of his dialogue options are genuinely quite funny. Joker isn't what I want him to be, but he doesn't do a bad job of being what he is. And if I had to describe all of the previous characters as either good or bad with no nuance, for all of my gripes, I would still settle on good. For these final three, however, alas, that's not the case. In terms of writing, I would say that Anne, Yusuke, and Haru are all done dirty. Anne is possibly the most interesting of the bunch, as while she has the highest highs, she also has what I believe are the lowest lows. So, Kamoshida arc Anne is fantastic. She's the first party member introduced, and the smile she gives Joker is probably the nicest thing that's happened to him since he moved to Tokyo at that point in the game. We also get to see her bounce off numerous other characters. While Anne tries to be positive around Shiho, there's this undertone of worry to each of their interactions. Meanwhile, Anne butts head with Ryuji, but it's clear that some of that is out of fear, as she doesn't think there's anything they can do about Kamoshida but endure him. Speaking of Kamoshida, it's clear she hates his company, but can't decline it, since he's holding Shiho's position on the volleyball team over Anne's head. Anne's struggles during this arc are deeply compelling. The root cause of most of her problems is fetishization. Kamoshida, and many of Shuden's students, view her as inherently loose, not due to any of Anne's actual actions, but simply because she happens to be both attractive and mixed race. At the same time, this attitude causes her to be reviled as well. Due to a combination of people viewing her as hot, yet Anne not meeting the mold of an ideal Japanese woman, she receives a ton of slut-shaming, being treated as an obstacle by many of Shudrin's girls and as something disposable by many of Shudrin's boys. Kamoshida Arc Anne is a beautiful exploration of a very pressing topic, and I know a lot of women and mixed-race people who relate to her struggles deeply. Back to the main story, Anne's scenes after her awakening are all great too. She and Ryuji slip back into this easy banter, which makes it so they actually do feel like they've known each other for ages. Meanwhile, Anne's rage towards Kamoshida makes the first palace brutally personal. In fact, she almost kills the man at the end of it, only deciding to spare him since she decides change of hearts are a worse fate than death. Yeah. Alas, the Madarama arc then comes around, and while Anne gets good moments in it still, such as her compassion being what pushes the team into reaching out towards the initially unlikable Yusuke, it's also when the big problem with her writing appears. Namely, after spending a whole ass arc going, hey, it's messed up that this literal teenager is being viewed as a sex object due to her looks, ATLUS turns Anne into the game's token fanservice girl and forces her into numerous sexually charged situations purely so horny otakus can lust over her. Yikes. Now, I'm not against fanservice in general. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is one of my all-time favourite games, so you know I've got a high amount of tolerance for it. While I generally don't find typical straight male gaze, scantily clad women very attractive myself, whatever. As long as the fanservice is equal opportunity, it doesn't normally bother me. I do care, however, in Anne's case, for 3 reasons. Firstly, she's underage. Now, teenagers absolutely experience attraction, and I think the subsect of adults who like to pretend desire starts at 18 need a reality check. But Persona 5 isn't a story written by a 16-year-old for other 16-year-olds. It's something written by a group of middle-aged men for mass consumption. They actively chose Anne to be the fanservice girl in a way the franchise doesn't normally do, and that just gives me the ick. Secondly, Anne is not the one putting herself into these charged situations. Anne doesn't offer to model for Yusuke nude. Yusuke attempts to coerce her into it. Anne is actively upset when the boys leer at her in the pyramid. Anne explicitly doesn't like her skin-tight leather catsuit. 90% of the time, she is explicitly uncomfortable with being viewed in a sexualized light. Like Christ, if you're going to add a fanservice character, at least make them do it deliberately, like Rangaku Bleach or something like that. Finally, turning Anne into the unwilling fanservice girl completely undermines the extremely powerful writing of the Kamoshida arc. ATLUS's condemnation of Kamoshida's actions just looks cheap when they end up writing things that encourage his exact mentality further down the line. It's gross, and it actively damages the story the devs are trying to tell. In fact, if I could change one single thing about Persona 5, for me, it's a toss-up between the Okamura arc and Anne's treatment in general. And boy howdy, you've probably already guessed how much I dislike the former. Alas, while not as egregious, the fanservice thing isn't the end of Anne's woes. Because while she feels like a present and relevant member of the team during the Madarame and Kaneshiro arcs, after that point in the game, her relevancy takes a sharp nosedive. She has no major emotional beats or vital plot contributions no one else could do by the time the Medched arc rolls around. Now, I will cut ATLUS some slack for this, as they have a lot of characters to work with, and logistically speaking, 1 or 2 of them are going to fall through the cracks. Still, it's a major bummer given ATLUS managed to keep the rest of the starting party relevant, and I really like Anne. She's one of my favourite thieves, so I wish the game did more with her. Yusuke. First things first, nice things about Yusuke. He's got some great comedic bits, and I think his confidant is possibly my favourite in the entire game. It's a great blend of comedic and heart-wrenching, and puts a really fascinating spotlight on Madarame's lingering effect on his life. Alas, the main story is not that kind to Art Boy. Firstly, Yusuke's introduction is rough. Now, I don't think a character coming off as unlikable at first is a bad thing at all, otherwise Makoto wouldn't be so high on this list. No, Yusuke's problem is the specific way he comes off as unlikable. He's introduced stalking Anne, aka a sexual abuse victim. Oof. Now, it's instantly made clear that Yusuke's intentions are benign. However, what a dreadful start in the wake of the Kamoshida arc. He then acts solely focused on Anne and is dismissive of Ryuji and Joker in a very snobbish way, which really doesn't help his case. While we get a few hints of there being something off with Yusuke's life, he gets hyper defensive of Madarame when the thieves bring up his potential abuse, which is another thing that knocked some points off me at first. Now, on paper, I actually like this since it's, well, a realistic reaction to his situation. Sure, Madarame isn't always the best to Yusuke, but Yusuke is still stuck deep into the denial phase. He's desperately clinging to the idea that the man who might as well be his father is a good person, while also dismissing any negative feelings he experiences as, hey, his life could be worse. Alas, unlike Makoto, the other initially unlikable party member, this idea gets hampered by the fact that, unlike her, Yusuke doesn't get POV sections during this part of the narrative, and therefore, it at first feels like he's being an arsehole just because he can. Meanwhile, by the time Makoto blackmails the thieves, we've seen what she's going through and understand why she's acting this way. And then, there's the final strike against pre-awakening Yusuke, him all but coercing Anne into modelling for him nude. Now, yet again, I do think it's understandable that Yusuke is annoyed at the thieves at this stage of the story, as they are all but harassing him into giving them dirt on his father. Still, this is just so bad considering Anne's past. However, Yusuke then awakens, and for a moment it looks like ATLUS are going to redeem his writing. Unlike Kamoshida, who everyone hated, Yusuke did have some genuine affection for Madarame. Seeing the sheer depths of his depravity is painful for Yusuke in a very visceral way, which makes your heart go out for him even though he hasn't made the best impression so far. His awakening itself is fantastic, along with his apologies to the thieves and his explanations of why he acted the way he did earlier. He vows to face the truth, no matter how ugly, and reveals the ugliness of Madarame's heart to the world. And then he doesn't do a single thing of substance for the rest of the story. Seriously, Yusuke could have just been an NPC, and nothing about Persona 5's creative narrative would change. He is literally just here for ice coverage. My gripes about Yusuke's introduction are just that, gripes. Petty complaints which would have damned him to A tier at highest, but not stopped him from reaching that point. His lack of plot relevancy, however, is terminal. You cannot have a character who's introduced in Arc 2 stop having any meaningful content after that point. Like, he gets a couple of cute scenes in a Medjed arc, but none of them are very substantial at all, and that's about it. On the topic of substance, let's talk about his relationships. I think his most compelling one is with Madarame, which gets relegated to Yusuke's social link. I guess he then bounces off Anne, Ryuji, and Futaba in fun ways, but that's kind of it. All of those relationships are pretty superficial and surface level at best. Yusuke lacks history with anyone in the main cast. He doesn't get interesting or compelling relationship drama with anyone else in the Thieves. None of his friendships change the story post Madarame. Instead, He gets reduced to being the weird, quirky comic relief guy, in a way that I personally find actively clashes with his far more insightful behaviour in the Madarame arc. Yusuke got done so dirty, man. Haru. So, Haru being at the bottom of the writing quality list probably doesn't surprise anyone. The sky is blue, water is wet, ATLUS butchered her character arc. My first issue with Haru, however, isn't her writing in-game, but her concept. Ryuji is a boy from a disadvantaged background who is decried as being no good for his anger issues, and is a sufferer of racial fetishization. Yusuke is a victim of exploitation by his boss. Makoto has an overbearing academics-focused guardian. Futaba is suffering from mental illness. You, average person watching this, have likely met multiple people experiencing the same issues as these phantom thieves, or have experienced them yourself. Haru, however, is Nobu Richie billionaire's daughter. I'm not saying she doesn't have struggles, that is just patently not true. But by default, this gives her power none of the other thieves have. In a game about the powerless using magic to stand up to those they'd never be able to in reality, this is a pretty big knock against her. Secondly, there's the specific form of strife she's facing in her life pre-awakening. Her arranged marriage. Yet again, this is obviously a phenomenon that happens. However, most people in arranged marriages are also not business tycoons, but people from middle to lower class families. Now, while arranged business marriages are a thing that happens in Japan, most Japanese people are, surprise, not the children of wealthy business moguls, so I don't even think that this is a values dissonance thing. Haru's hyper-specific situation is just not universally relatable in the way that other thieves' lives are. Whenever I see someone say they relate to Haru, it's solely due to her personality, not her background. For obvious reasons, that ain't good. I really think Haru needed a different premise, or, at bare minimum, something else that made her plight a bit more relatable. Maybe she could have actually been overweight like Sugimura suggests. Or maybe she could have a mental or physical disability of some sort. Who knows? I'm just spitballing things here. As is though, I think Haru has the weakest concept of any of the human thieves by a mile. Now though, let's talk about her role in the plot. It's bad. Late game party members in the previous modern Persona titles, Shinji and Naoto, are weaved into the plot early on and have a load-bearing role thematically or narratively. Haru, meanwhile, has one or two minor cameos at best before she's probably introduced in September in a game that potentially ends in December. Adding a whole new character that late into the story is just a dumb idea. ATLUS would have been better served giving the pre-existing cast more attention instead, as Yusuke and Anne can attest to. Except, ATLUS tried to have their cake and eat it too, and attempted to have this Morgana and Ryuji fallout arc on top of introducing Haru to the cast. While there's scenarios where this could have worked, in execution, it basically means what's supposed to be Haru's arc is overshadowed by the most trite, hackneyed conflict in the game. Haru does get some nice moments in the Okumura arc, don't get me wrong. I think her and Morgana's friendship is quite sweet, and I do like how while she still criticizes her father for his corrupt business practices, she eventually acknowledges that deep down inside, her main motivation for standing up to him is more selfish in nature. I think that was a fun idea, and could have been something interesting to explore in her Confidant, or God forbid, the main plot. Still, while she does have some good moments in her introductory arc, she's got some whiffles too. Firstly, there's the whole thing where she gets a pseudo-persona we never see before she awakens properly to Milady. This feels like it was shoehorned in purely to make her a red herring for the Black Mask, and it comes at the cost of dampening the impact of her true awakening. Secondly, there's the boss battle against Shadow Okamura. This should be the moment where Haru sticks it to the man and proves she's a true phantom thief. But instead, she gets taken in by his manipulation and Morgana has to save the day. It's what happens to Haru after the Okamura arc, however, that really stinks. Because it's nothing. She's aloof to the phantom thieves for a few days, and then she just slides back into the team like nothing happened, and that's it. She doesn't get a big solo confrontation with Shido or Akechi, her voice getting lost amongst the rest of the phantom thieves. She doesn't blame the thieves for her father's death, which could have caused some interesting conflict, and perhaps added a bit of spice to Sai's palace. On top of this, Haru's relationships with the rest of the thieves, aside from Morgana and cardboard cutout Joker, aren't developed at all. She calls Makoto a cutie nickname and then they proceed to have no interesting personal interactions ever again. Similarities between her and Yusuke's situations are never acknowledged. Hell, even her bond with Morgana becomes totally obsolete post-Okamura arc. To make matters worse, unlike Yusuke, Haru doesn't even get a particularly compelling confidant to make up for this. ATLUS avoided the obvious approach of making it about her relationship with her father, probably because they were scared of making it a bit too similar to Yusuke's. But as a result, it just feels like a watered-down version of his instead. It's just, oh man, it's so bad, guys. Haru's writing is so bad. Villains. Now that I'm done with the main cast, I'm going to talk about the rest of the characters as collectives. And first up are the bad guys. Persona 5's villains are vastly overhated in my opinion. One of the biggest criticisms I see about them is that they are unrealistic. This is a take I fundamentally disagree with. Firstly, every single major palace ruler that doesn't eventually join the heroes is either based on a real person or a widespread social issue in Japan. Lady Virgilia made a great video on this that I'll link in the description, as she does a great job of breaking this down. Secondly, the villains get decried for being one-note and evil, with no redeeming features whatsoever. The vast majority of them exist to be as hateable as possible. Except, surprise! As certain real-life events have hopefully proven over and over again the last few years, most genuinely bad people do not possess large amounts of nuance. If someone is notably cruel to one subset of people, they are likely cruel to everyone else as well. The Kamoshidas, Okamuras, and Shidos of the world don't have tragic backstories. They don't have any actual legitimate reason for acting like they do. They are just selfish. And people that selfish are just fundamentally shallow. So yeah, I think it's appropriate that most of the palace rulers are just really nasty one-note people. I also love the positions in society ATLUS gave each of the palace rulers. Cruel teachers, callous CEOs, and corrupt politicians are all people that peddle large amounts of societal harm and are all people we have suffered under, whether directly or indirectly. As I mentioned in the themes section, the palace rulers are all also people the phantom thieves would face judgment for questioning. There is a reason 4 out of the 7 human palace rulers are parental figures in one way or another. So, each of the palace rulers have good premises which contribute to both the thieves' arcs and the game's overall themes. At the same time, I don't think that Persona 5's villains are perfect. While I'll talk about them individually in the plot overview section, there are some issues the villains all share. For one, I really wish ATLUS kept their idea of making the will seeds in Royal contain flashbacks of the palace ruler's past. I can see why they ditched this idea because, I think it's justifiable for ATLUS to be leery about humanizing someone like Kamoshida too much, but I absolutely think it could have been possible to show the root cause of each ruler's distortion, while making it clear that their behaviour is and always was unacceptable. Two palace rulers in particular really suffer due to this, but yet again, more on that later. There's also a consistent problem with the palace rulers post-Madarame too, their lack of presence in the story. Kaneshiro meets the Phantom Thieves like once. The only person on the team who ever sees Okamura face to face is Haru in like one cutscene. While Shido appears on the television and in person once or twice, his interactions with the thieves are all completely forgettable outside of his plot-triggering confrontation with Joker. In contrast, you can run into Kamoshida in the school. His presence weighs over you constantly. It's a pity, since despite people like Kaneshiro and Shido being way more threatening than Kamoshida, he's the palace ruler that feels the most dangerous. You've also probably noticed that I haven't mentioned Yaldabaoth yet. Yeah, he sucks. More on that later though. Confidants. As of my Persona 4 video, I'm not going to go into any of the confidants individually. I'd like to finish this video one day after all. Still, as a collective whole, I really like Persona 5's greater cast. I think ATLUS learned from their past experiences to create a wide array of likeable, thematically interesting characters. So the first, kinda petty advantage Persona 5's confidants have is that there's only like two school links, Mishima and Hifumi. And Mishima's is so tied into the main storyline it doesn't really feel like a school link at all. From a meta-narrative perspective, I think this is really neat. All of the non-thieves in Shujin are scared of Joker after all, so he needs to make his connections elsewhere. Secondly, a lot of Persona's school links are just pretty bland. By having a lot more adults in Joker's social circle, the confidants get to explore way more intense and interesting subject matter than what they otherwise could have with random high schooler number 500. Related to that, I also love the choices of who becomes Joker's confidants. Just like him, they're basically all outcasts in one way or another. Takemi is a dodgy doctor, Yoshida is a disgraced politician, Owai is ex-Yakuza. Many of them don't make the best first impression either, coming off as sleazy or sinister, except as Joker gets to know them better, these initially transactional relationships turn into true friendship. Joker gets to see these frequently reviled people as people. Takemi was scapegoated. Yoshida has genuinely improved himself as a person. Owai is just trying to do his best for his son. I also think the confidants are really interesting from a gameplay perspective. In previous titles, ranking up a social link simply benefited you in the Velvet Room, giving you better fusions. Now, however, each confidant gives Joker some sort of skill, ranging from the convenient but not hugely memorable, such as cheaper healing items, to the completely and utterly overpowered, such as being able to pay yen to get personas above your current level, and finally, the completely and utterly useless, such as lowered security levels. Now, I think this system could have been balanced a bit better, so that each skill is desirable but not hugely game-breaking. At the same time, this gives the player a lot more motivation to actually rank up confidants, including ones they probably wouldn't have gotten to the meat of otherwise. Finally, I'm also a big fan of how the vast majority of them are associated with a Mementos mission. I think this ties the daily life sections of Persona 5 into the dungeon crawling in a neat, convenient way. And man, taking down some of the targets feels very satisfying. Of course, this is my nitpicking video, so it's time for me to do that. Yeah, this part of the vid is about the adult confidant romances. So, if you've somehow gotten this far into the video without having played Persona 5, which, why? You would know that Takemi, Oya, Chihaya, and Kawakami are all romance options, despite the fact that Joker is 16 and they are all in like their 20s or 30s. So most people tend to react to this in one of three ways. Camp 1 of people freaking hates this. because they think that these romance options are both illegal and immoral. Camp 2 of people acknowledges that, yeah, the optics of these romance options suck. However, they themselves are adults and they'd much prefer to date another adult with their self-insert avatar. Camp 3 of people, meanwhile, just don't care, and while they are happier than the rest of us, I judge them for their lack of principles. I personally have sympathy for Camp 2. If I had to choose one of the Confidants as my love interest, it'd be Takemi. I'm not immune to goths. However, I fall into Camp 1 myself, as undereducated teenagers play this game, and I don't want them thinking it's normal for adult women to express interest in them. I'm also firmly in Camp 1 for one more reason. Specifically, by portraying, say, Kawakami/Joker as totally okay, it completely undermines the message of the extremely potent Kamoshida arc. While these romances are a very minor part of the gameplay at most, and honestly, there's no ship tease between Joker and any of the adult Confidants unless you as a player initiate it. They are just so egregiously bad, I had to talk about them. While we're on this topic, I've also got to talk about the lack of gay romance options. Now, I'm not as annoyed as I am by, say, Persona 3 Reload not allowing me to reciprocate Ryoji's feelings. Persona 5 first came out in 2016 after all, and while LGBT romance options were beginning to show up in mainstream Japanese video games, they still weren't exactly common. Still, I do think it's kind of a bummer that there wasn't at least one male romance option, and Royal not adding one also stinks. No, Ikechi doesn't count, he's queerbait. On the topic of mechanics, it's time to move on to gameplay. Persona 5 is the first game in the Persona franchise where I really think ATLUS nailed the non-social sim elements. The addition of baton passing finally makes the game's combat stand out from base SMT, in contrast to Persona 3 and 4's One More system, which is a worse version of press turn. Being able to swap to the party member of your choice after hitting a weakness is a great reward for playing the game properly, as it's very useful when it comes to SP management, and it really makes the combat a lot more snappy too, which I love. It's also great from a Ludo narrative perspective, as it makes your party members way more useful, which is a good trait in a Power of Friendship game. The addition of technical damage also adds another layer to the combat. It makes the various magical elements feel less homogeneous, and it makes status ailments actually useful for once, instead of a nothing burger they were in previous titles. While I do prefer Persona 3's physical triangle, I will give Persona 5 some points for splitting physical into at least 2 elements, even if gun is woefully underutilized in the vanilla version of the game, given ammo doesn't auto-reload between fights. On the topic of gun though, I love that there's a menu option that's just gun. It's so funny. It's not just the combat that sets Persona 5 so far above its predecessors, it's the dungeon crawling too. At long last, ATLUS has mostly moved away from the random generated hallways of Persona 3 and 4 and has finally made actual handcrafted dungeons. Palaces being static locations is great from a narrative perspective, as it allows the environmental design to contribute a lot more to the storytelling. But oh god, is it glorious from a gameplay one. Firstly, it allows the Palace's gameplay to be more meaningful and more layered, with the navigation ramping up in genuine complexity as opposed to simply getting more tedious. And finally, at long last, ATLUS can include actual, proper puzzles into its gameplay design. The fact that most dungeons aren't structured like it also makes me more tolerant of mementos. Persona 5's sole randomly generated dungeon. It's still not super exciting, but due to a combination of the Mona boss, some plot-related missions, and plenty of save points you can easily navigate between, it's still much better than the OG Tartarus and the TV world, even without the royal additions of Yose and his flower collectibles. I only have one real criticism of Persona 5's gameplay, and that's the difficulty level. I think ATLUS on the whole does a really poor job of making their higher difficulties genuinely harder, as opposed to just more grindy. I think Persona 5's Merciless mode is a step in the right direction, as it changes how gameplay functions, increasing extra damage for enemies and allies alike. Still, how hard is it to just make the enemy AI better? Good lord! Okay, yeah, it is a little bit hard, but the point still stands. This actually has some repercussions a bit more serious than dude bros complaining about it online too. The player doesn't need a deep understanding of mechanics like baton pass and technical damage to complete 90% of Persona 5. Which is why so many people struggle with a certain boss fight in Royal, as that is literally the only part of the game which skill checks the player for these things. I'll talk about that more though in the Okamura section of the plot review. On that note though, it's finally time for me to talk about the plot. I think, on the whole, Persona 5's plot is really good. As I said earlier in the video, I think the pacing is tight, the characters are mostly strong, and the themes are interesting. I think Persona 5 also has the best premise of any Persona game. The metaverse and the palaces are a rich, fascinating concept, with so much more flexibility than the supernatural conflict in Persona 3, for example. I love the way the real world and the supernatural world are intrinsically connected, one affecting the other. Do I think the plot is perfect, however? No. While I enjoy all of the broad strokes of the story, the devil, yet again, is in the details. While none of my complaints are narrative ruining by any means, I still have them. Let's start with the Kamoshida arc. The Kamoshida arc is the best arc in the game, hands down. This is not a dunk on the rest of Persona 5. The beginning is really just that good. Firstly, there's the in media res introduction. We know Joker is eventually going to get caught by the police after being sold out, which adds an immediate narrative hook. Going back to the story's true beginning, the disdain Joker receives is visceral. The first person who shows him any compassion at all is Ryuji, who Kawakami tells Joker to stay away from since he's trouble. We're then introduced to this complicated web of relationships the cast shares, former childhood friendships that have all been ruined by Kamoshida, two victims who should be able to take solace in each other, who don't because of their fear of Kamoshida, Anne, who lets Kamoshida steamroll her to save Shiho, and Shiho, who keeps the worst of his abuse a secret to spare Anne. You've probably noticed one thing these various connections have in common: Kamoshida. In other words, the character that makes this arc. ATLUS set out to make the most hateable guy possible, and they succeeded. Firstly, his presence is everywhere. He's a school hero, lauded by students and teachers alike. No matter the egregious acts he commits, he's immune to consequences because of this. He can break Ryuji's leg and get away with it since he's a former Olympian, and Ryuji comes from a broken home. He can expel the boys on a whim, which would ruin Joker's whole life, and no one will question it since Joker is a criminal. He treats the volleyball team like slaves, yet gets away with it since the team's parents care more about their child being associated with someone prestigious than they do about their health. He is this vile, inescapable overlord that looms over Shujin. It is completely reasonable for the cast to risk life and limb to use the untested taking hearts method on him, especially given how bad the Shiho incident is. On the topic of the cast, Anne and Ryuji are both at their A-game here too. Ryuji's dumb but deeply lovable, and we get a good view on both his impulsive temper and his deep-seated sense of justice and compassion. We see how he's mistreated for not fitting into the mold. From Kawakami's comments to Kamoshida deliberately goading him by bringing up his abusive father. We get so much range from Anne here too, from her despair and resignation towards her circumstances, to her kindness and compassion, and finally, her righteous fury towards Kamoshida. The exploration into her abuse and fetishization, as mentioned earlier in the character section, is really powerful too. Kamoshida literally views her as a sex object in his mind, for crying out loud. On the topic of his palace, it's a great introduction to the concept. The king in a castle metaphor is simple, but to the point, and it makes good use of elements such as cognitions to reinforce the game's narrative. The gameplay is pretty basic, but then again, it's the tutorial level, so I'm going to cut it some slack. The arc ends on a high note too, and contemplating just flat out killing Kamoshida is a great moment, and seeing his confession is deeply satisfying after all of the pain he caused the main cast. Now, there are a couple of minor issues with the arc, however, they are so small they don't knock off any points for me. Firstly, the period between arriving in Tokyo and entering Kamoshida's palace for the first time drags on a bit. I don't think this is as bad as it is in other Persona titles, since there's at least the scene in the casino to catch the player's attention, but it's still worth noting. Secondly, I personally find that the gameplay is a bit over-tutorialized and the metaverse is slightly over-explained. Like, it's a magical world based on people's perception of reality. I really don't think that's a hard concept to grasp. At the same time, I can't knock off any points about either, as I've seen people making posts mid-Kanashiro arc admitting they have no idea what's going on. Finally, there's the fact that outside of the palace, there's really not much to do beyond like free social links. Yet again, however, that's super minor and really only a New Game Plus issue. So yeah, overall, I'm rating this one a 10 out of 10. The Madarame arc. The Kamoshida arc was always going to be a tough act to follow, and while the Madarame arc succeeds in some ways, it fails in many others. The stuff before Madarame himself appears is all pretty strong. I like the scene in the Wilton Hotel, from the way the other patrons turn up their nose at the thieves despite the fact that they paid their way there legitimately, well, semi-legitimately, to the brief encounter with Shido, and finally, the team deciding to continue phantom thieving for good. It's a solid scene that encapsulates a lot of the game's themes, even if it does start the trend of Shido being uncharismatic and incredibly hateable in all of his in-person scenes, which is a problem given the character he's meant to be. I also think the introduction to both the fan site and mementos is pretty good too. It's nice seeing Mishima regain his spirit now that he's out from under Kamoshida's thumb, and mementos is a nice bit of lore as well. Unfortunately, as I mentioned in Yusuke's character section, things get a bit rougher from there. His introduction is not good, and unlike Anne, who could be a bit of a jerk at first too, there's no immediate implication there's something wrong in his life. He doesn't look unhealthy, and there's no abrupt change in his behaviour when Madarame arrives. Still, I'll give ATLUS some points here, as I do believe Yusuke's unlikability is deliberately emphasised to make Madarame look better. Unlike Kamoshida, who puts up red flags very quickly, it takes time for Madarame's mask to crack. And before it does, he's pretty convincing on paper. I also think it's a nice touch that Ryuji is pretty gung-ho, instantly believing all of the rumours about Madarame, while Anne is far more cautious. So this is all ultimately pretty moot, as there's zero reason at this point for the player to think that someone having a palace is anything but an indicator of moral depravity. Madarame's kindly act is pointless, since the second you enter his palace, it's clear he's the arc villain, even if the player doesn't know why yet. I really would have preferred it if Madarame put up red flags instantly if it meant Yusuke got to be more sympathetic right off rip. And that sort of leads me to my next problem with the Madarame arc, and that's its concept. So, While I think exploitation by an adult figure you owe something to is fairly universal, the fine arts angle just isn't. Even the broader notes of Yusuke's specific situation really aren't that relatable on the whole. It also doesn't help that Madarame's plagiarism habit is given more focus than his habits of, defaming, emotionally blackmailing, and neglecting people in his custody, which are all a lot worse than art theft. Plus, unlike Kamoshida's actions, we don't really see the horrible effects of Madarame's actions on screen, not until he threatens to cut Yusuke off anyway. Sure, he ruined Nakanohara's life, except half of you have probably forgotten who that even is, because unlike, say, Mishima, he's a no one who disappears from the story completely after giving an expedition dump about Madarame's actions. On that note though, let's talk about Anne. Sure, the scene where she rocks up to the atelier wearing a whole wardrobe is pretty funny, but I hate the reason why it happened. Yusuke stating he won't humour the thieves anymore unless Anne models nude is icky. Though, to be fair, he has no idea of her history and is under a lot of pressure from Madarame, even though it would have been nice if that was more explicit. Plus, finally, I think it's pretty fair for Yusuke to have run out of patience with Ryuji at this point. Still, this is the first step into Anne's descent into being the token fanservice girl, so it whacks a solid point off the arc for me. Still, the Madarame arc isn't all bad. Yusuke's reaction to the forged Sayuri is a very powerful scene, and can really just see him lose all faith in the man he viewed as a father in real time. Good stuff. His awakening is one of my favourites too. Yusuke tearing at the ground with his nails and leaving bloody streaks behind. Yeah, it's good stuff. I also enjoy the final heist a fair bit too, as while it ends up being for naught, I enjoy that the thieves actually try to steal something stealthily for once. The palace too is a good step up from Kamoshida's both puzzle and combat wise. Shadow Madarame is a good skill check boss, especially in Royal. You can't just spam damage against him, and I approve of that. Finally, I think Yusuke obtaining the real Sayuri is a very sweet scene. It's not a bombastic end to the arc, but it's a deeply human one, and in many ways, that's far more important. Ultimately, I'd give the arc a 6 or a 6.5 out of 10. It does have some nice parts. All of the Phantom Thieves being relevant for one certainly helps, but honestly, while I still think it's enjoyable, it's the second worst arc in the game in my opinion. Kaneshiro arc. So, starting off with a hot take, the Kaneshiro arc is my second favourite in the game. And that's because it's not actually the Kaneshiro arc, it's the Makoto arc. First things first though, this is where Akechi makes his debut. His intro scene is so good. He's established as a threat almost instantly, sweet talking the crowd around into agreeing with his anti-Phantom Thief stance with ease. Then there's his slip up with Morgana, which is pretty damn subtle, but sets up so much plot-wise and character-wise. With the power of hindsight, it's clear Akechi already knows who the Phantom Thieves are at this point, due to snooping on them in Madarame's palace. He approaches them with ulterior motives. Unbeknownst to Akechi, however, Joker also knows who he is behind the mask, and is also putting up a front when he agrees to Akechi's deal. I love things like this. The real star of this arc, however, like I said, is Makoto. While I raved about this in her character section, god damn I love her here. We get numerous Makoto POV scenes here, and they do a great job at humanizing her. We see Kobayakawa manipulate her into being his attack dog. We see the enormous pressure Sai puts her under, along with the lack of emotional support Sai gives Makoto in turn. We see that Makoto genuinely wants to do the right thing, but is basically told to shut up in turn. We see Akechi heckle her unprovoked, followed by Anne digging into her insecurities. It's no wonder she snaps. Makoto's awakening is great too. Her breaking the ground is such a fun detail, and Johanna is easily the most iconic party member persona in my opinion. Now though, we need to talk about the elephant in the room, Kaneshiro. So to be blunt, he's just here to cross off some T's. He's there to be a socially acceptable target the fandom thieves can take down to get more clout, along with being the trigger that pushes Shido to move against the fandom thieves. As a human being, Kaneshiro is deeply unimportant to this arc. I don't actually mind this, however. Firstly, I think having a crime lord having any major impact on the main cast's lives is a bit contrived. I've seen multiple people suggest that he should have been the one responsible for Makoto's father's death, but I really don't like that idea. For one, it would derail the arc from being about Makoto growing as a person to being about Makoto getting justice for her father's murder, which is literally just a gender-flipped version of what happened last arc. No thanks. I also think that idea is a lot less relatable and empowering than the pre-existing ending of the arc, where Makoto politely tells Kobayakawa to shove it, and shakes her head at Sai's antics. As with the ending of the Madarame arc, they are not dramatic moments, but they are powerfully human, and I like that more. Also, Makoto coincidentally running into the crime lord that was responsible for her dad's death is just stupid, honestly. And not to mention, her father's death having an unsatisfactory resolution really just makes it feel more impactful for Sai and Makoto alike. No, I'm more than happy for Kaneshiro to have no personal connections to the main cast whatsoever. Like I said, this arc isn't about him. I do have a problem with Kaneshiro, however, and that's his threat level. The missed deadline ending for the Kaneshiro Palace is really chilling, and goddamn, I wish the infiltration managed to maintain that level of stress. Sure, Kaneshiro apparently messages Makoto a few times, but it's completely off screen. As a result, once the player starts his palace proper, Kaneshiro stops feeling like an actual threat in the real world. It's a big downgrade from Kamoshida, and even a downgrade from Madarame, who's at least a constant present in Yusuke's life. Onto the palace itself, I think it's fun gameplay-wise, and I do find the hints that Kaneshiro was a victim himself once pretty interesting. Though I definitely think he was a victim of ATLUS removing the Will Seed flashbacks. Or well, not adding them to begin with. While I don't mind Kaneshiro being a non-entity plot-wise, I think his mind palace should have given him a bit more characterization, as he could have been an interesting foil to the thieves. As it stands, I'm giving the Kaneshiro arc an 8 out of 10. I really like what it does for Akechi, Makoto and Sai's characters. However, it really could have been a 10 out of 10 if Kaneshiro's thugs just tailed you occasionally and a rock got thrown through Ryuji's window or something. The Futaba arc. The ball keeps on rolling when the game hits the Futaba arc, which is probably the most unique arc in the entire game. First of all, the Phantom Thieves are faced by an enemy they can't beat with the metaverse for once, the hacker conglomerate Medjed. This, however, is also probably the weakest part about the arc, because, well, if Kaneshiro's threat level plummeted after his single in-person appearance, Medjed never had a threat level to begin with. It's really hard to care much about them as antagonists when they don't actually do anything to anyone. Sure, perhaps you could argue this is fridge brilliance on ATLUS's behalf, given Medjed turns out to be a conspiracy ploy deliberately designed to have their asses kicked by the thieves, but I think that's giving them too much credit. Much like Kaneshiro, however, this arc ain't about them, but Futaba herself. And yeah, everything surrounding the Sakura family is great here. Firstly, I love the return of Sujiro's anger here. After the last few months in-game, he's mellowed out to Joker considerably, so his fury once Joker starts to pry into Futaba is impactful. The moment where Sujiro finally lowers his walls and lets Joker into his life is great too. Because yeah, while Sujiro is mellowed out, there's still been a wall between him and Joker up until this moment. signified by the way the player can only do the first few of his confidant ranks. Now, however, he's truly opening up to Joker, and goddamn, I love the found family of it all. Sojiro's love for Futaba is equally poignant as well. You can tell how much he cares about her, and it's so good. In general, his relationships with Futaba and the posthumous Wakaba are beautifully conveyed. But honestly, the highlight of his arc is Futaba herself. In other words, the first palace ruler not to have a palace because she's evil, but simply because she's distorted. For once, the players aren't roaming for a palace to take down a villain, but to help a uniquely troubled teen. It's a really creative use of the concept of palaces and the metaverse. And on that note, the interplay between the palace and real life is great in this arc too. The thieves entering the metaverse in front of Futaba's door, but ending up miles away from her palace is a great touch, along with the distance between the pyramid and the town. The shadow wanting to help the thieves, but also sabotaging them is a brilliant characterization moment. And I thought it was so neat how Futaba's breakdowns in the real world actively affect her palace and vice versa. What I really need to commend the pyramid for, however, is the fact that it has flashbacks. And dear God, it's amazing how much they add to the experience. Especially since, as Sojiro's conversations about Wakaba made clear, they're inaccurate flashbacks. Because Futaba is, let's say it again, distorted. The palace has a great ending too. Futaba's awakening, while not as high per se Yusuke or Makoto's, is very cathartic. I enjoy the way it leads it to being more Persona 4 styled, and it's so nice seeing Futaba regaining her spirit as she realizes the truth. Cognition hack is a fun ability, and her making peace with the cognitive Wakaba at the end is a deeply satisfactory conclusion to the arc. The Futaba's arc brilliance doesn't end there, however, because Futaba then gets an entire ass week dedicated to showing her developing both her confidence and her bonds with the rest of the thieves. These scenes tend to range from touching to really damn funny, and really make the fandom thieves at this point feel, well, like a teen. Moving away from the Sakuras and onto the rest of the arc, I suppose I should also give a shout out to the scene where Sai tries to blackmail Sojiro, which would have been an excellent descent into villainy moment if Sai didn't spend the last arc being a jackass. On the topic of Sai, less derogatorily, I also really like her scene for Akechi in this arc. On a first playthrough, it's completely benign, but on a second one, it's like, oh, Akechi is actively encouraging her distortion here. Moving on to Akechi, this is also the moment where he gives his infamous trauma dump about his mother. Well, yeah, I agree that it's a little bit abrupt in vanilla, or if we haven't been doing his confidant. However, I do think it's a good moment in general, because, for the first time ever potentially, Akechi is actively trying to humanize himself to Joker. Not for any benevolent reasons, mind you, but because he wants Joker to feel some form of rapport towards him when he attempts to infiltrate the thieves in like a month from now. I also think it's deeply telling that Akechi gives this trauma dump in front of Futaba of all characters. In some ways, I think it's sort of the closest thing to an apology Akechi is willing to give her. He's basically saying, look, the person who ruined your life also had their life ruined. Take catharsis in that! Which is like, not as good as an actual apology would be, but also very Akechi core / derogatory. Still, I can't give the Futaba arc anything higher than an 8 out of 10. Firstly, there's the medjed stuff I mentioned earlier. That whacks off half a point. Secondly, this arc also has my least favourite scene in the entire game, namely the animated cutscene where the boys perv on sexual abuse victim Anne while driving to the pyramid. Who the hell at ATLUS thought that was a good idea? Finally, however, this is the first arc in the game which I think has major issues with its core structure, and that's that the pacing of this arc sucks. Normally, Most palaces have a deadline of around 2 in-game weeks. That gives the player plenty of time to prepare, while also still putting a little bit of pressure on them. Futaba's palace, meanwhile, has a deadline of almost an entire month. And once the player can start freely roaming a palace, the plot outside of the palace pauses. Given you absolutely don't need a month to clear the pyramid, this leads to large chunks of this time period feeling empty. Plus, the excuse used to stop Futaba taking down Medjed until it's plot convenient is that she's sleeping. Which means, for many players, she falls into a coma for like 2.5 weeks. This is especially galling, as the Okamura arc would have loved to have a little bit more time to breathe. The Okamura arc. So, I think the Okamura arc has a lot of interesting ideas, which it executes very poorly. The general setup for this arc is that the Fame gets to the Phantom Thieves' heads, and they, initially, choose to change Okamura's heart for shallow reasons. The growing conflict between Ryuji and Morgana, combined with the latter's insecurities, leads to him leaving the team and joining Haru, who calls out the Phantom Thieves for their shallowness. After Sugimura is deeply unpleasant in the real world, the Phantom Thieves are reminded of their justice, Haru admits her motives weren't ideologically pure either, and everyone becomes friends. The end. Except, this is all deeply undermined by the fact that the fame doesn't actually go to any of the Phantom Thieves' heads. No, literally everyone but Ryuji thinks the hype they receive post-Medjed is really weird. In fact, when the team argue about changing Okamura's heart at the start of the arc, they are all in fact extremely conflicted about the idea of going after a guy because of a popularity poll, and mainly consider it due to the data they stole from Sai's laptop. This is deeply annoying to me, as the idea of an arc where the thieves abandon their morals for popularity and then later pay for it is really actually quite neat. Instead, that literally doesn't happen, but the game still acts like it does, constantly treating the thieves as being in the wrong during its beginning. Secondly, there's the Ryuji and Morgana fight. As I mentioned in their character sections, this is something I like on paper. Morgana's insecurities have been built up pretty well until this point, with Futaba in particular bringing out his feelings of inadequacy by taking over his role as navigator, which is a good moment of ludonarrative harmony. This moment really could have been a very good dramatic beat. The problem is that the trigger for Morgana leaving the team is really forced. Ryuji decides to stop pushing the team to change Okamura's heart after everyone else expresses their doubts, and then Morgana calls him out for wanting to change Okamura's heart for shallow reasons, even though Ryuji had literally just stopped doing that. Ryuji then points out Morgana has exterior motives too, which is true, and then Morgana leaves in a huff to change Okamura's heart by himself. Like, it doesn't make sense. This specific conflict makes no sense. Like, sure, Ryuji bringing up Morgana's goal of turning himself back into a human does genuinely hit an insecurity of his, but the build-up and most especially the conclusion of this conversation is bewildering. Plus, the other Phantom Thieves have way more motive to change Okamura's heart than Morgana does at this specific moment. Why the hell is Morgana getting so offended by the thieves not immediately leaping to change Okamura's heart, when like 10 seconds later, he's calling out Ryuji for getting high on their popularity? Like, seriously. While this isn't a rewrite video, I can think of at least half a dozen ways to fix this moment, so Morgana leaving the team here actually makes sense. There is no excuse for this specific moment to be so bad. Next, I've got to move on to Ryuji's behaviour during this fallout. While, unlike many people in the fandom, I absolutely think the conflict between him and Morgana isn't purely Morgana's fault. Ryuji still acts jarringly immature during the period of time where the thieves are trying to get Morgana back onto the team. Yet again, this is really annoying, as it would have been incredibly easy to make this work. Like, all ATLUS needed to do would be A. Have Ryuji legitimately not realize he and Morgana were engaging in anything else other than casual banter, which therefore leads to him being genuinely baffled about why he needs to apologize, or B. Have Ryuji not apologize since he's also pissed off at Morgana for being so consistently nasty to him. That brings me to the final part of the Morgana-Ryuji conflict, specifically the way that the game frames Ryuji as being the one in the wrong. As I said, I don't think Ryuji is an angel. He started their feud, but do you know who escalated it? Morgana. Ryuji owes Morgana an apology for consistently denying his personhood, yes, but Morgana owes Ryuji one too for consistently belittling him. I do think the scene where Ryuji stands up to Sugimura for Morgana's sake is really quite nice though, and I generally enjoy Morgana and Haru's dynamic too. I suppose this is a good moment to segue into talking about Haru. I already said most of what I wanted to say about her in her character section, but I just want to reiterate again how much this arc does her a disservice. The more I think about it, the more I believe that A. Haru could have just been a non-playable confidant, or B. just not included in the arc at all. Quite frankly, the only place where her absence causes a genuine issue is that Sugimura wouldn't meet the main cast without her, and ergo, we'd lose the scene where Morgana and Ryuji make up. Haru and Okamura's relationship is just not hugely impactful given the amount of shitty parental figures that have appeared so far in the game. In fact, it does nothing but make Okamura look like an even larger arsehole, which in his case is a bad thing. Morgana having someone to support him during the Phantom Thieves fallout is nice, but hardly narratively load-bearing. While Haru's true awakening is pretty good, and it's very satisfying defeating cognitive Sugimura with her, yet again, this has no major or even minor impact on the narrative long term. Most damning, however, is the final confrontation against Shadow Okamura, where Haru gets suckered in by her father's lies and Morgana has to save the day. I hate this for both of them. Quite frankly, I would have preferred the conclusion to Morgana's arc not being, oh look, he's useful after all. But it doesn't matter if Morgana is useful since he's a Phantom Thief anyway. He doesn't get as done badly as Haru, however, who's had her entire introduction overshadowed by the Morgana-Ryuji conflict, and now, instead of getting a moment of triumph against her father and saving the day, she flops and needs Morgana to bail her out. So yeah, none of these scenes needed to happen, and a couple of them actively make the arc worse. Haru isn't the only Okamura done dirty, however. I don't like her father's writing either. Throughout the interrogation room and after the arc ends, Okamura is portrayed as a victim, as someone who wasn't a saint, but really wasn't bad enough to deserve getting targeted by the Phantom Thieves, let alone suffer a mental shutdown. He's meant to be the Phantom Thieves' greatest failure, pre-Akechi anyway. Except this framing completely falls flat, since in terms of sheer scale, Okamura is easily the second worst palace ruler after Shido. He works his robot workers to their deaths, his robot workers that represent real people. Okamura isn't some ignorant rich guy unaware of the harm he's causing. He knows it and doesn't care. The real nail on the coffin though is the appalling way he treats Haru. If he was a bad person, but a genuinely good father, it would make the way he's treated posthumously make a bit more sense. If Okamura genuinely loved and nurtured Haru, and that was reflected in his palace, it'd still be awful, but at least he'd have a redeeming feature. But no, instead, he's happy to sell his daughter to a guy he knows is a sex pest. At the bare minimum, Okamura really needed the scrapped Willseed flashbacks. Haru telling the player that he used to be nicer just does not cut it. Suffice to say, Akechi shooting him in the head was ultimately more satisfying than it was horrifying, and that was not what ATLUS was going for here. On that topic though, the ending of this arc is genuinely great. The player knows things are going to go horribly wrong, but the Phantom Thieves are totally oblivious to that, thinking they've saved the day right until Okamura dies horribly on live TV. And for all of my antipathy towards Okamura, it is genuinely a chilling moment and the perfect setup for the Phantom Thieves' darkest hour. Before I finish with this arc, however, I need to talk about the gameplay. Specifically, I think the juxtaposition between the vanilla and royal versions of the game is really interesting. So, Okamura's palace in vanilla is an absolute slog, capped off by a bland, easy boss battle. Everyone who's only played royal is probably wrinkling their faces right now, but yes, vanilla Okamura is like the easiest major boss in the game. But I do think that's kind of neat from a Ludo narrative perspective, in terms of, making a fun gameplay experience. It's not great. So, for royal, ATLUS course corrected. Okamura's palace was trimmed down significantly, and thank God for that, while the difficulty of his boss battle was ramped up. Unfortunately, ATLUS course corrected a bit too much, and Okamura is now generally viewed as the hardest boss in the game. As I mentioned earlier, to defeat Okamura in Royal, you really need to know how to exploit weaknesses, technical damage, and baton pass. All things the casual player does not have to pay attention to. On top of that, however, there is also a timer. A timer that continues counting down during the cutscenes and is ergo shorter than it seems. This is just a terrible combination. The game really needed to actually teach players how to maximize technical damage before this point, or slap like another 5 minutes onto the timer. I am pretty decent at Persona, and had played the vanilla game before, but when I played Royal, I only had like 2 minutes to spare by the time I beat Okamura. Suffice to say, there's a reason that to this day, I see people whining about this boss. All in all, I can only justifiably rate the Okamura arc 4 out of 10. It does have a few good moments and an interesting concept, but quite frankly, it's the only part of the game I actively dislike playing. The Sai arc. Sai's arc is weird. The beginning is super strong. Tensions among the Phantom Thieves are high. Sojiro has found out their identities, their fans have turned on them, the police are ramping up their search for the thieves, and they've just realised the conspiracy has completely played them like a fiddle. ATLUS did an excellent job with this part of the game. It's so tense, and there's this profound sense of hopelessness affecting the thieves and the player alike. There's no clear solution to their problems, and you can feel the noose tightening around the thieves' necks. Until sassy baka Goro Akechi comes around for a deal that's almost too good to be true, that is. Akechi's threat has been lurking in the background for a while now, with him clearly knowing the thieves' identities, but now, to make matters worse, he has physical evidence to boot. Akechi throughout the entire cultural festival is fantastically written. There's the funny takoyaki scene, sure, but more pressingly, he has this complete dominating control over the situation. There's nothing the thieves can do about him, and both they and Akechi know it. Then, however, the infiltration of Sai's palace begins, and it sucks ass. Okay, so Gameplay-wise, music, and visual-wise, Sai's Palace is probably my favourite. It looks good, it's fun to play, and the whims of fate slaps. In terms of narrative, however, I think this has the most wasted potential out of all of the palaces. The core problem is that the infiltration is centered around showing off Akechi's character, and God, it sucks. Firstly, Akechi is absolute fakest here. We basically learn nothing about who Akechi truly is as a person, beyond some comments about his justice being selfish, which don't really hit home. Secondly, Akechi's relationship with Sai is completely surface level and superficial, unlike, say, Yusuke's with Madarame and Haru with her father. Sai's palace itself does not invoke any particularly interesting or genuine interactions out of Akechi. The only thing the palace does do is rub in the fact that Akechi is smarter than the thieves, which the players already know and have known for a while. Dear God, it's tediously repetitive. The next core problem with Sai's Palace is that it does a dreadful job at being a character study for Sai herself. So, the casino works really well as a metaphor for Japan's justice system, which has a 99% conviction rate. Not Sai herself, since I see some people getting confused by that, but the country as a whole. If you are taken to criminal court in Japan, you have a 1% chance of being sentenced as not guilty. Yeah, it basically is like gambling against the house. You are going to lose. At the same time, this metaphor says nothing about Sai herself as a person. The fact that she's pretty much guaranteed to get a conviction if she takes a case to court is just a fact. Compared to, say, Kaneshiro viewing Shibuya as a bank, or Okamura his company as a spaceport, it's deeply impersonal. There is no proof that Sai actually used fraudulent evidence, stacking the deck in her favour beyond the mere fact that she's a prosecutor to begin with. Sai's risk-averse tendencies are pretty subtle in the real world, and her agreeing to take charge of the Phantom Thieves investigation feels less like a high-risk gamble on her behalf, and more like something she was emotionally manipulated into doing by her boss. On the topic of her palace being impersonal, it also does a bad job at humanizing Sai, and also does a poor job of representing envy on top of that. Now, I buy the fact that Sai's greatest sin is envy. It shows in some of her conversations with Makoto, her boss, and Akechi. Shadow Sai doesn't come off as jealous, however, but conceited. There's nothing in Sai's palace about her insecurities or envy towards those who have happier lives than her and struggle a lot less to boot. Like, we get a little bit of her desperation shown by the posters on the wall, but that is it. It's not built into the palace's architecture like Kaneshiro's greed or Kamoshida's lust. Sai's palace also does literally nothing to make Sai more likable, which is dreadful, given the Phantom Thieves' entire plan revolves around relying on her to save Joker's life despite her distortion. It's also such a letdown too, since I'm interested in exploring Sai's trauma. She clearly has a lot of it after all. Frick, I think bloody Kaneshiro's palace says more about him than Sai's palace does about her. It's bad. Finally, as I mentioned in the character section, Makoto is woefully underutilized in this palace. To a degree, it's because she's hiding the plan, but I think it's such a letdown that we don't see her growing more upset by the casino before she snaps, or attempting to justify Shadow Sai to the other thieves, or anything like that. The only thing Makoto does is look vaguely upset in the background until the Shadow confrontation, where her moment is partially usurped by Akechi at his fakest. Ugh. However, all of the stuff after the fight against Shadow Sai is peak. The best part of the game, hands down. We've finally caught up to the present day. Sai isn't swayed by Joker's justice. However, agrees to humour his strange request to show the traitor Joker's phone. The traitor, Akechi, gives a whole ass villain monologue for shooting Joker in the head. But then we get the reveal. Yeah, the Phantom Thieves knew about Akechi from day one and have been playing him for a fool this entire time. God, Joker smirking in the interrogation room is such an iconic moment. Like, it's some peak heist movie shit. The plan has seemingly failed, but psych! That was never the actual plan to begin with. ATLUS tricks the player into thinking that the traitor reveal is meant to be the twist at this moment, even though it's fairly obvious Akechi is the bad guy. Except, it's not. That twist is just a red herring to distract the player from the true plot twist. Akechi is the bad guy, and the Phantom Thieves already knew that. Everything about the ending of this arc is gold. Akechi going full mask off is great, and immediately makes him 500% more fascinating. It's deeply funny seeing Sai hoodwink the conspiracy after they dismissed her as a foolish woman. And it feels so good when the Phantom Thieves snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the Sai arc. A garbage middle surrounded by absolute cinema. I think I have to give it a 7.5 out of 10. While the good parts are an easy 10 out of 10, the bad parts are really a 5 out of 10 at most. Bushido arc. Bushido arc, while not being a standout in my opinion, is solid. All of the cards are now officially on the table. Akechi and Shido have outed themselves as the big bads, and Sai and Sujiro are now officially in the loop. Now, I wish Sai's apologies to Makoto and the Sakuras got a bit more of the spotlight, but I can see why it didn't, as there's really not that much space for it pacing-wise. Let's now talk about Shido himself, however. So, firstly, I enjoy how the thieves taking on his palace is a narrative full circle. Shido getting Joker arrested, followed by him being rude to Joker and Ryuji in the Wilton Hotel, is what started the Phantom Thieves to begin with, and now they are going to take him down. That's neat. I also enjoy the visual metaphor of the cruise ship palace, with it being a Noah's Ark for the rich and famous while the rest of the country drowns. Despite its luxurious appearance, it's filled with shallow lies and has walls slathered by propaganda. Does a decent job at character building, but not a good enough job for the guy who's being touted as the story's final villain. I think that's my big problem with this arc. Shido's palace ticks the boxes. It's not the best palace gameplay-wise in the game, but it's hardly the worst either. The narrative has built up Shido's threat, and it does feel like a climax. It comfortably does the bare minimum amount of things it needs to do, unlike, say, the Okamura arc. The problem is, however, that Shido is just not a hugely compelling villain. Firstly, with the exception of Akechi, most of the harm he causes feels fairly abstract, I guess? Like sure, yeah, Shido gets Joker a criminal record, but all things considered, moving to Tokyo turned out pretty well for him. Shido's responsible for Wakaba and Okamura's death, but let's be real, no one's mourning the latter, and it's not like he could have killed either of them if Akechi wasn't willing to pull the trigger. And I suppose that's the thing. While Shido causes a lot of harm, he mainly does it indirectly by hiring someone else to do the actual deed. Secondly, Shido lacks charisma, which I think is the real kicker for him. As I said in the villains section, I don't think Shido should have hidden depths or anything, but I do think he should be entertaining to witness. He should be so overtly vile, you love to hate him, like the culprit in Persona 4, for example. Or he should be genuinely good at putting on a benevolent act, like Prince Akechi. As is, while the game acts like Shido has charisma, we never see it. Whenever the thieves encounter him in person, he's just blatantly rude. and not in a particularly memorable way. It would have been much better if Shido was sort of passive-aggressively cutting in the way Detective Prince Akechi is, where you know he's being rude, but Shido also has too much plausible deniability for you to call him out on it. I also want to flag Shido's lack of personal connection to the thieves. Now, I don't think he should know or pay attention to them in the real world. A bunch of teenagers are fundamentally beneath him after all, but I do wish his shadow made a few cameos throughout the palace. For one, Ikechi's fate would be even more horrible if, instead of having the awful truth behind his plan revealed by a cognition, Shadow Shido himself made a brief cameo to personally twist the knife in further. On that note, however, there is something this arc does exceptionally well, and that's Akechi. He's so good here. Firstly, I love the little detail where Akechi attempts to shield the thieves from Shido by telling him not to worry about them until after the election, aka after the date where Akechi plans to reverse their positions and put Shido under his control. That's fun, along with the oddly deferential way Akechi refers to Wakaba. They are very subtle moments, yeah, but they do say a lot. They don't say nearly as much as Akechi's appearance in the engine room does, however. His confrontation with the Phantom Thieves is so juicy. Seeing Akechi go full mask off is great, and the black mask reveal is mwah, chef's kiss. Loki's design is fire, Akechi's rage is palpable, and I love the little detail where he targets Joker more than the other thieves. The conclusion to the scene is equally as lit. With his rage extinguished, we finally see Akechi at his truest. He's no saint. In fact, he's a nasty piece of work. At the same time, he's a victim of society too, and he's so close to accepting the Phantom Thieves' offer to join them when the door is, metaphorically and literally, slammed in his face. Because like I mentioned earlier, pride is Akechi's downfall. Shido knew who he was the whole time and has been playing him like a fiddle, prying on Akechi's deeply buried desire for his last remaining parent's affection. Akechi, finally realizing his plans were doomed from the start, decides to put his faith in the Phantom Thieves and sacrifices his life for them. I know there's a vocal minority of people who wanted Akechi to have a happy ending, but honestly, I think this was a perfect conclusion to his arc. It's tragic, yes, but that's the point. As Akechi himself states, he met Joker too late. He's the victim the thieves couldn't save. He's the last person to die for Shido's reign of tyranny, the final, personal motivator for the thieves and the player to kick Shido's ass. Honestly, I think my only quibble with Akechi's death is the way its impact doesn't really linger. The thieves are pretty upset by it when it happens, sure, but it would have been fun if Joker had to take a day off because he was mourning. Or, God forbid, we got to see Sai's reaction to the news. Moving on, the final calling card is another deeply iconic moment. Seeing Joker appear on live TV, yeah, it's good. I enjoy the Shido confrontation too, even if I'm not a huge fan of the solo Shido vs Joker segment they added in Royal, since I think it goes against the game's teamwork and friendship themes. I have slightly more mixed feelings about what happens afterwards. Sai and Sujiro both getting arrested is a good moment, as it adds some real tension to the heist. This tension isn't resolved once the thieves successfully change Shido's heart, however, as the palace begins to collapse around them. While I'm normally a hater of death fake-outs, sorry, but I've watched one too many shonens where they are done to death, I think Ryuji's is pretty effective here. It ups the stakes, gives the player a real moment of panic, only for them to get hit by a wave of relief. Things were tense, yes, and the thieves and their allies were in genuine danger, but in the end they prevailed, which I think really suits Persona 5 thematically. Alas, then the beat up Ryuji scene happens. Yeah, Ryuji teasing Anne for crying over his presumed death was probably slap-worthy. That That slap, however, should have been followed up by a group hug where everyone was pretty much in tears of relief. It should not have been followed up by more violence, especially considering Ryuji is a physical abuse victim. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the Shido arc. Most of it is fine. There's one scene I and most other people really hate, and one scene I and most other people absolutely love. I would give it a solid 7 out of 10. If Persona 5 had ended here, I would be happy. Alas, however, that's not what happened. Memento Steps. This arc didn't need to exist. I don't think it should have. Full stop. To explain why, I want to talk about conflict types in literature. Most stories revolve around a particular form of conflict. Man versus self, man versus nature, etc., etc. Persona 5 is very firmly a man versus man story. This is a game built around conflict between people. The Phantom Thief's goal is to defeat human beings who utilize human structures to commit harm. But then suddenly this arc comes around and the story pivots out of nowhere to change into a man versus God one. So the remnants of the conspiracy mess around with cognitive science, making it so that the general populace ignores Shido's change of heart. Because of this, the thieves go on one final heist to destroy mementos, which will sever their access to the metaverse, but ensure Shido faces justice. And then, giant space flea from nowhere, Yaldabaoth, shows up, nukes the thieves from reality, and tries to destroy the world. This is just not the logical direction thematically or structurally for the story to go in any way whatsoever. Sure, in some loose sense, Yaldabaoth is man, as he spawned out of people's desire to entrust everything to a system so they don't have to think for themselves. I don't, in theory, hate the idea of people's apathy for change being the Phantom Thief's final target. In fact, I quite like how Memento Steps is depicted, being a giant prison where shadows give up their free will. It's a neat bit of imagery. Still, Yaldabaoth is written a lot less like a genuine conglomerate of people's sloth, and far more like a generic JRPG god that exists purely so the Phantom Thieves can kill it for the hype factor. While unlike Izanami, there's at least a sprinkle of foreshadowing for his existence. It's very minor, and Yaldabaoth's barely incorporated into the game's actual main narrative, aka the mental shutdown and Shido conspiracy plot at all. Let's talk about that foreshadowing, however. It's Igor. Between Persona 3 and Persona 5, his Japanese voice actor sadly passed away. Unlike in the West, when that happens, instead of just hiring a replacement, it's not uncommon for a character to just be written out of a story instead. In fact, I'm dead positive this is why we never see him in either of Persona 5's spin-offs, and instead just get Lavenza. Igor did appear in Persona 5, however, with a new, ominously deep voice, which might have made a few people arch a brow before ultimately shrugging. Going with a completely different voice direction was probably just dismissed as ATLUS needing to include the character, but not wanting to just get someone in to mimic the former actor. This, however, is actually a piece of foreshadowing that Igor is not actually Igor at all, along with one or two other ominous lines he makes. Except this foreshadowing only works if you have played either Persona 3 or Persona 4. If Persona 5 is your first Persona title, you're to just assume Igor is meant to be a little bit creepy. The false Igor's betrayal also loses a lot of potential impact because, let's be real, he was never hugely likable to begin with. All of the reveals related to the Velvet Room fall flat as, unless you are already attached to it as a concept, Persona 5 doesn't really give you any reason to care all that much about it. Still, while narratively it's a nothing burger, I will admit that the final fight against Yaldabaoth There's a lot of hype going for it. I love how Mishima pumps up the crowds and how it's reflected in the fan site's poll hitting 100% for the first time. I love the way the Confidants cheer for Joker. I love Morgana here, and quite frankly, in terms of sheer cinema, Saturn Isle's Sinful Shell is easily ATLUS's most hype final boss finishing move. The end of this game from this point onwards is also really good, except for one thing. Morgana's death fake out. There's this whole ass animated cutscene where Morgana starts disappearing from reality once Mementos is destroyed, with him saying he might return if the thieves believe he can, as cognition shapes reality. It's quite a beautiful scene, though it causes a big problem, as while Morgana reappears basically instantly, in the vanilla ending, he stays away from the thieves until Joker reunites with them out of pride. Like, what the hell? Who thought that was a good idea? Either don't have the death fake out at all, have the death fake out resolved instantly, or have it so Morgana only reappears when Joker does. Good lord, it's bad. So, like I said, the rest of the ending is cinema. First of all, reality ensues. Despite having recently killed God, Sai needs Joker to hand himself into the police as she needs a metaverse-savvy witness to get Shido imprisoned. So yeah, after enjoying Christmas Eve, Joker goes to jail for violating his parole. It's not a downer ending, however. After months of hard work, the people Joker saved eventually hunt down the woman whose false confession got him arrested in the first place, and successfully overturn his original conviction, clearing his record and buying him his freedom. It's such a beautiful moment thematically speaking. Joker's kindness and compassion are rewarded, as the outcasts he befriended save him from prison. While it wasn't easy, it took time and hard work, and Joker had to endure jail in the meantime. Eventually, the thieves and the Confidants' struggles are rewarded. While terrible things happen in Persona 5, ultimately it's a triumphant game. The bad guys get their just desserts, and the good guys get their hard-earned victory. The ending cutscene then beautifully wraps things up together. Joker needs to return home, but his friends are determined to be at his side, turning it into an impromptu road trip. While the feds try to tail them, still regarding Joker as a threat due to his past, the thieves outwit the shitty adults one last time, escaping their clutches and driving off into the distance together, happy and free. So yeah, while the Mementos Depths isn't the strongest arc by any means, I'll give it a 6.5 out of 10, if only for the ending. It's got a lot of faults, but even then, it's more enjoyable than not. Conclusion. If you enjoyed my word vomit about Persona 5, like and subscribe. I'm planning on eventually following this video up with a sequel, where I write about what I do to fix my numerous issues with the game. Back to the video proper though. In my Persona 4 vid, I had this decent chunk I wrote in defense of ATLUS. I think Persona 4 is a bad game, yeah, but I also think a lot of my problems with it stem from the fact that ATLUS only had 2 years to make it, and the fact that it was made in like 2007. For Persona 5, on the other hand, I don't really think its faults are that excusable, because sure, yeah, there's some hints development wasn't smooth, but ATLUS had an actually reasonable amount of time to work on this game. The studio knows how to write, so there's no justification for things such as the Okamura arc being as messy as they are. I still love Persona 5, however, warts and all. There's a reason I fell in love with this game, and as a result, the Persona franchise at large. It's fun, it's exciting, it's innovative, it's charming. For everything that pisses me off about Persona 5, there's 2 things I'm obsessed with. I love Persona 5, and in many ways, that's why I'm harsh on it. It's on the precipice of perfection, and with a little bit more foresight, this game could have easily been a 10 out of 10. For now though, that's all folks. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm happy to read your thoughts on Persona 5 in the comments below, even if you disagree with me. Well, as long as you're not an asshole about it, that is. Later!